Tonight, we travel to Nuremberg, January 1356, in the Great Hall of the Hoftag. It is the 10th of January in the free imperial city of Nuremberg. Emperor Charles IV, who was also King of Bohemia, stands before the assembled princes of the Holy Roman Empire to proclaim a new law. The document he presents will bind Germany for 4.5 centuries. It is called the Golden Bull, and it names 7 men who will choose kings and emperors, a role they exercised until the empire's dissolution in 1806. You are standing in the great hall of the imperial residence, and the winter cold has settled into the stone walls so thoroughly that even the torches cannot fully drive it from the air. Around you, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire have gathered for the Hoftag, that solemn assembly where Charles IV, King of the Romans and Holy Roman Emperor, intends to bind the future of German kingship to parchment and law. The right to elect German kings emerged gradually from the 10th century onward, replacing earlier hereditary succession. And now, in this frigid hour, that evolution reaches its codification. You feel the January frost on the cobblestones of Nuremberg's castle courtyard through the soles of your boots, a chill that has crept upward from the earth itself, persistent as the disputes this gathering seeks to end. The hall stretches before you, its timber ceiling lost in shadow above the reach of the flames. Wood smoke from the great hearths mingles with the scent of parchment and ink, that particular aroma of government in winter, of decisions made while breath still clouds in the air. The electors stand in their factions, their furs and heavy cloaks marking their rank against the cold. You are watching them arrange themselves, these 7 princes who hold between them the power to make and unmake kings. The 4 secular electors by the early 14th century were the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia. The 3 ecclesiastical electors were the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. You notice how the Archbishop of Mainz already claims precedence among electors by the 13th century, his bearing unconsciously asserting that ancient privilege as he moves toward the place of honor. Charles IV enters, and the assembly stills itself by degrees, not through command, but through the gradual recognition of presence. He is 50 years old, his face lined by the exertions of holding a throne that his own election had proven to be uncertain. Charles IV himself had been elected in 1346 at Rennes, not Frankfurt, in a disputed election against Louis IV. He knows, as you know, as every man in this hall knows, that the Golden Bull was thus partly his attempt to prevent future disputed elections and legitimize his own rule. The emperor does not look like a man who has come to claim power, but like one who has come to distribute its boundaries, to mark where ambition may travel and where it must halt. The history that has brought them here lies heavy in the room, almost palpable as the smoke. The Staufer dynasty's extinction helped produce the Great Interregnum, which lasted until 1273, and that memory of nearly 20 years without a recognized king haunts every negotiation. During the Interregnum, Richard of Cornwall and Alfonso, the 10th of Castile, were both elected in 1257, 2 foreign candidates who held their titles in name, but were largely unable to rule Germany effectively. The Interregnum demonstrated the fatal weakness of unclear electoral rules, and the princes who survived that chaos emerged determined never to suffer such uncertainty again. You watch their faces in the torchlight, these men who remember fathers or grandfathers who had lived through those years of competing claims, of taxes paid to no certain authority, of justice delayed until it became injustice. Rudolf, the first of Habsburg, ended the Interregnum in 1273, but remained a weak king dependent on elector support, and in that dependence lay the seed of what grows here tonight. The electors increasingly demanded privileges, territories, and confirmations of rights in exchange for their votes, each election becoming a marketplace where the currency was pieces of empire itself. The number and identity of electors fluctuated before 1356, creating repeated succession crises, and each crisis left scars upon the body of imperial authority. In 1198, both Philip of Swabia and Otto IV were elected by rival factions, leading to a double kingship that split Germany into armed camps before their rivalry was resolved by Philip's assassination in 1208 and Otto's eventual exhaustion of support. By the late 12th century, a small group of secular and ecclesiastical princes had established themselves as electors, but that establishment remained informal, customary, vulnerable to the ambitions of those who stood just outside its circle. You move through the crowd of attendants and secretaries, past the tables where jurists from Bologna and Prague bend over preliminary drafts, their fingers stained with oak gall ink. The slow drafting process, with input from jurists and princes across the empire, has occupied months of correspondence and negotiation. But the decisive shaping happens here, in this January assembly, where presence carries weight that letters cannot convey. The smell of beeswax and sealing wax in the cold hall grows stronger as you approach the chamber where the emperor's clerks prepare the final instruments. Each seal that will be affixed represents a party to be satisfied, a claim to be acknowledged, a future dispute to be prevented by the very specificity of what is now inscribed. The disputed double election of 1314 between Louis IV of Bavaria and Frederick of Austria remains a notable historical example of electoral conflict in the Holy Roman Empire. For 8 years, 2 kings had held their rival courts, issued their rival charters, granted their rival fiefs, until the battlefield at Muhldorf and the long imprisonment that followed had settled the matter in Louis's favor. But that settlement had required war, and war required the destruction of resources that the empire could scarce afford to lose. Charles IV, who had himself benefited from disputed election, understands better than most that the beneficiary of chaos remains vulnerable to its return. The electors met in various cities, with Frankfurt gradually becoming the preferred location for elections, yet his own elevation had occurred at Rennes, in the shadow of disputed legitimacy, and that shadow he now seeks to dispel by the brilliance of golden seals. You find yourself near a window, its glass too precious to be common, its leaded panes distorting the view of Nuremberg's rooftops beyond. Distant bells of St. Sebaldus Church mark the hours of debate, their sound muffled by the stone and the cold, reaching you as if from another century, another order of time. The city below carries on its commerce, unaware of what is being determined in this height, or perhaps aware only in the way that cities always know that power moves above them, that their prosperity depends upon arrangements they will never witness. You press your palm against the glass and feel the frost that has formed on its inner surface, crystals of ice, that your warmth begins to melt into patterns of transient water. The Archbishop of Mainz speaks, and his voice carries that particular resonance of a man accustomed to being heard in large spaces, to projecting authority without apparent effort. Mainz already claimed precedence among electors by the 13th century, and that claim now finds its formal recognition in the document being prepared. You watch the other ecclesiastical princes, the archbishops of Trier and Cologne, observing how they receive this confirmation of their colleagues' primacy, whether with resignation or with the satisfaction of men who understand that ordered hierarchy serves all who participate in it. Their collective weight against the 4 secular princes represents the Church's enduring claim to guide the conscience of empire, even as secular power grows in wealth and military capacity. Evening comes early to January, and the torches must be renewed, their light flickering on the faces of men who have argued since prime. You are standing now near the great hearth, where the heat makes a small island of comfort against the pervasive cold. The wood smoke mixing with the scent of parchment and ink creates an atmosphere that seems to suspend time itself, to make this moment continuous with all the other moments, when men have gathered to bind the future by words written down. The secular electors confer in a group apart, the Count Palatine's hand resting on his sword, as if to remind all present that his vote carries the implicit weight of armed men. The Duke of Saxony listening with that stillness which conceals calculation. The Margrave of Brandenburg glancing occasionally toward the King of Bohemia, his fellow northerner, seeking alliance against the Rhenish prelates. Charles IV moves among them, not as emperor commanding, but as negotiator seeking consensus, and in this movement you perceive his particular genius. The document took its name from the golden seals affixed to 6 of its 7 copies, though this name only became common in the 15th century. Charles IV reportedly called it simply our imperial lawbook in contemporary sources, and that plain description may better capture his intention than the romantic designation that posterity would confer. He does not seek to create a monument, but an instrument, something that will function when he is no longer present to guide its application. You watch him lean toward the Duke of Saxony, his head inclined in that posture of attention that makes men feel their words are weighty, their concerns legitimate, their support worth cultivating. The night deepens, and the negotiations continue by candlelight now, the torches having burned to their sockets. The jurists have withdrawn to revise clauses in response to objections raised in the day's session, and you pass their chamber where the scratch of quills competes with the murmur of consultation. The smell of beeswax and sealing wax persists, though no sealing happens tonight, only the preparation for that final ceremony when all agreement has been reached. You are tired now, as these men are tired, and the January frost on the cobblestones seems to have penetrated inward, to have become a condition of the spirit as much as of the body. You find a place against the wall where you may observe without participating, where the weight of your presence does not alter what unfolds. Each receives his particular confirmation, his specific guarantee, his named territory and jurisdiction, and the spiritual authority of the ecclesiastical princes finds its temporal expression in the precedence and procedure that the lawbook establishes. You feel the weight of that history in your shoulders, in the slight ache of standing too long in cold air, in the awareness that what happens here will shape the experience of generations who will never know your name or your witness. Fluctuation ends tonight, or so Charles IV intends, so the jurists believe, so the princes hope as they trade their final concessions for their final confirmations. Dawn comes late to January, and when it comes, it finds the hall still occupied, the negotiations having continued through the night in shifts of attention and delegation. You have slept against the wall, wrapped in your cloak, and wake to find the torches renewed, the hearth rebuilt, the assembly resumed as if no interruption had occurred. The demonstration of weakness has been sufficient to sustain this extraordinary exertion, to keep men at their work when ordinary business would long since have adjourned. The memory of Rudolf I's dependency, of the compromises that weakness required, drives Charles IV to accept the compromises that strength now demands. You move toward the light, toward the windows where morning shows grey against the glass, and the distant bells of St. Sebaldus mark the first peal of the new day. The city below begins to wake, to stir with the sounds of commerce and craft, of lives that will be touched by what is decided here, but will continue in their patterns regardless. Nuremberg now joins that series of assembly cities, this Hoftag adding its weight to the custom that will become rule, to the practice that will become law. The document lies on the great table, its clauses arranged, its language settled through the night's final negotiations. The slow drafting process approaches its conclusion. though you understand that conclusion is also commencement, that the signing and sealing will mark the beginning of interpretation, of application, of the disputes that no document, however detailed, can entirely prevent. You watch Charles IV approach the table, his hand resting on the parchment not with possession, but with something more complex, the recognition that what he has made will now make him, will define his reign in terms that extend beyond his own intentions. The torchlight flickering on the golden seals as the document is presented will come later, in the formal ceremony that concludes this assembly, but already you can imagine that light, the way it will transform the wax into something precious, something that carries the authority of empire in its very material. In that attempt, you perceive both the particularity of his situation and the universality of political ambition, the desire to secure what has been gained against the entropy of time and competing will. You are standing now at the edge of the ceremony, your presence no longer necessary to what unfolds, your witness complete in its essentials. Charles IV's personal history informs every clause, every precaution, every binding of future possibility. The cold remains, but your body has adjusted to it, or perhaps the excitement of conclusion generates its own warmth. The long story of electoral right now receives its definitive telling, its authorized version, and that establishment, tested by centuries of dispute, finds its confirmation and its limit. You are aware, as the ceremony proceeds, of the weight of your own fatigue, of the sleep that has been pressing at the edges of your attention since before dawn. That fluctuation ends here, or so the document declares, so the seals will attest, so the chronicles will record for those who come after, who will read this moment as stability achieved, as order established, as the empire secured against its own tendencies toward fragmentation. The voices around you blend into a texture of sound rather than distinct speech, the Latin of formal pronouncement giving way to the German of practical arrangement, the rustle of departing feet, the clink of vessels being cleared, the gradual emptying of a space that has held so much concentrated purpose. The ancient division of 1198, that precedent of chaos, finds its answer in the unity of this assembly, in the single document, in the collective will to prevent recurrence. The memory of the Storfer void, that absence of legitimate authority, sustains the commitment that has brought these men through this January night into the clarity of resolved purpose. The experiment in external solution, those two foreign kings elected by the interregnum's desperate princes, finds its repudiation in the careful definition of who may elect, who may be elected, what constitutes the legitimate exercise of this most sovereign power. You are moving now with the departing crowd, through the passages of Nuremberg Castle, toward the courtyard where the January frost still holds the stones in its grip. That demonstration has been sufficient, has been answered, has been transformed into the positive law that will govern all future successions. The model of dependency, of royal authority derived from and constrained by princely grant, finds its systematic expression in the confirmations and privileges that the law book contains. The accumulated demands, gathered across decades of elections, now receive their comprehensive satisfaction, their once-for-all settlement that will, it is hoped, free future elections from the particular bargaining that has so often delayed and divided. Each departs with his specific confirmation, his named territory, his established jurisdiction, and their spiritual authority, their precedence and procedure, their role in the ceremonial of election, all find their definitive form. Mainz's long-contested claim now receives its acknowledgement, its formal establishment as part of the constitutional structure of empire. The gradual preference for Frankfurt, that emerging custom, now receives its reinforcement, its designation as the normal place of assembly, with Nuremberg and other cities assigned their particular roles in the larger system. That personal exception, that deviation from emerging norm, now finds its absorption into a larger legitimacy, its transformation from anomaly to precedent controlled, from dispute to resolution demonstrated. In the morning light of Nuremberg, with the frost beginning to soften at the edges where sun reaches stone, you perceive the success of that attempt, the way that personal intention and institutional necessity have converged in this document, this moment, this cold and solemn January achievement. You imagine those golden seals, their weight and brilliance, the way they would transform the parchment into something almost sacred, almost beyond the ordinary processes of alteration and decay. That plain description, that refusal of grandiose titling, speaks perhaps to his understanding of what endures, of what functions, of what matters not for the brilliance of its presentation, but for the solidity of its construction, the clarity of its provisions, the workability of its arrangements. You are standing in the courtyard now, and the cold air moves across your face with the freshness of morning, with the promise that winter will in its time yield to spring, that this moment of frozen clarity will dissolve into the ordinary flow of seasons and events. The disputed double election of 1314 recedes into the past, its particular violence absorbed into the general lesson, its specific outcomes overridden by the new provisions that will govern hereafter. Charles IV's own contested election in 1346, supported by only 5 of 7 electors, finds its resolution in the comprehensive settlement that now binds all 7, that defines their identity so precisely that future absence or dissent will constitute not alternative legitimacy, but mere rebellion, not competing election, but simple schism. The Hoftag at Nuremberg, January 1356. Charles IV's determination to prevent future chaos has found its instrument, its expression, its lasting form. The administrative aftermath continues even now, in the copying and distribution, in the notifications to cities and princes who were not present but whose acknowledgement will be sought, whose obedience will be presumed, and if necessary enforced. You are walking now through the streets of Nuremberg, and the ordinary life of the city surrounds you, the merchants opening their shops, the craftsmen at their benches, the smell of bread from the bakeries and of metal from the forges, the sounds of a community that will continue regardless of what has been decided in the castle above. The January frost remains in your memory, though you have left that space, though the sun rises higher and the day grows warmer by degrees. The torchlight flickering on the golden seals exists in the future perfect of historical narration, the tense that declares completion from the standpoint of those who will look back. The smell of beeswax and sealing wax persists in your clothing, in your hair, in the sensory record that outlasts conscious attention. You find yourself by the river, the Pegnitz flowing through Nuremberg with that particular sound of urban water, constrained by walls and bridges, but still moving, still carrying towards some larger body, some eventual sea. The distant bells of St. Sebaldus mark the hours no longer, for the debate has ended. The hours have found their resolution. The bells now merely tell the time of ordinary life, of meals and work and rest. The smoke of historical occasion has yielded to the smoke of 1,000 domestic fires, the ordinary heating of ordinary spaces, the warmth that sustains without the grandeur of solemn assembly. You are tired now, deeply tired, the fatigue of witness and of cold, and of sustained attention in a space where much was said, and much depended upon understanding. The river moves before you, and you watch its surface, the way light plays upon the current, the occasional fragment of ice that has not yet melted, that carries downstream toward whatever warmth will finally dissolve it. Around you, the city continues its patterns, indifferent to your presence, to your witness, to the history that has happened and will be recorded, and will in its turn become the foundation for further history, further witness, further moments of cold halls where the future is shaped by those who have survived the past. The water moves, the light changes. You are standing by the river in Nuremberg, and the Golden Bull of 1356 exists now in the world, in its copies with their golden seals, in the archives and the notifications, in the consciousness of those who will be governed by its provisions and those who will study its making. The cold persists in your bones, in the memory of stone and frost, in the awareness that history happens in particular places at particular moments, in the bodies of those who endure the conditions of its making. You breathe the air of January, of morning, of a city that has been the scene of great events, and will be again, that carries its history in its stones and its customs, and the gradual accumulation of its institutional memory. Sleep presses upon you now, the sleep of completion, of witness ended, of the body demanding rest after the exertions of attention and cold, and the sustained presence that historical moments require. The river sound blends with the city sound, with the distant bells, with the murmur of a community continuing in its ordinary life. You are here in Nuremberg in 1356, and you are also elsewhere in the sleep that approaches, in the warmth that memory provides against the cold that still surrounds you. The water moves. The light changes. The history has happened, and you have been present, and now the presence yields to rest, to the sleep that is also a kind of witness, the body's own recording of what the mind has attended and will in its time return to, transformed by the restorative absence of consciousness. You are standing in the great hall of Nuremberg Castle on the 10th day of January, in the year 1356. The cold has settled into the stone walls, and your breath mingles with the thin smoke of braziers that struggle against the winter air. Around you, the princes of the empire have gathered in their heavy robes, their fur collars brushing against the parchment they have come to witness. You feel the particular silence of a great hall when a law is proclaimed that will outlast all present, that silence which is not emptiness, but the holding of breath by 200 men who understand they are present at the making of permanence. Charles IV, King of the Romans and of Bohemia, sits before them on a raised seat. You observe the care with which he has arranged this moment. This man, whose own election in 1346 had been contested by the partisans of Louis of Bavaria, whose legitimacy had been forged in conflict rather than consensus. The Golden Bull of 1356, the Nuremberg Lawbook of 10 January 1356, is his answer to that uncertainty, his instrument for securing not merely his own throne, but the succession of his son Wenceslaus, whom he intends to place beyond the reach of dispute. The parchment before him has been prepared in the scriptorium with ink of oak gall and iron, written in Latin, the language of imperial administration, that tongue which carries law across the German lands as the river carries water to the sea. The document is unrolled, and you hear parchment crackling as it yields to the January cold, that sound like the turning of pages in an empty library, like the first step on frozen ground. The notary begins to read. The Golden Bull declares the empire an everlasting structure that could not be divided, and you feel the weight of that declaration settling into the air, the assertion of continuity against the fragmentation that has threatened these lands since the death of Frederick II. Each elector receives specific territories designated as Kurland, lands inseparable from the electoral dignity, and you understand that Charles is binding power to place, making the privilege indivisible from the territory that sustains it. The light in the hall comes from narrow windows set high in the walls, and it falls upon the assembly in pale rectangles that do not warm, but only mark the passage of the morning. You move through the crowd, and the merchants who have come to witness stand apart from the princes, their woolen cloaks less fine, but their eyes equally fixed upon the king. The cold air moves across your face as a door opens somewhere in the passage beyond, and the draught carries the smell of wood smoke from the kitchens, the ordinary life of the castle continuing around this extraordinary moment. The Nuremberg portion contained chapters 1-23, dealing primarily with the elector's privileges and the election procedure, and the notary's voice continues through these provisions with the steady rhythm of a man who has rehearsed each phrase. The electors were granted full sovereignty within their territories, including rights of coinage, tolls, mining, and jurisdiction, and you observe how Charles balances each grant against the others, how the careful balancing of privileges among the 7 electors prevents any single power from dominating. No appeals could be made from electors' courts to the emperor's court, and this independence, this elevation of the princes to near-sovereign status, is the price Charles pays for their support, the coin with which he purchases their agreement to his son's future election. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, though this is a different harbour, a different dawn, the memory of water and light that the sleeping mind produces when the body rests in stillness. The water moves, the light changes. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, and their voices carry across the morning air with the particular roughness of men who have been long at sea. The frost has formed upon the windows of the hall, and through the rime you can see the shape of the courtyard below, the figures moving with the slowness of cold. The electors were freed from many imperial taxes and obligations, and this freedom, too, is part of the careful architecture of the bull, the structure of incentive and reward that Charles has constructed with the patience of a man who understands that law is not merely command, but negotiation, not merely assertion, but the weaving of interest into obligation. The Golden Bull explicitly forbade cities from forming leagues or alliances without elector approval, and you recognize in this provision the hand of a king who has seen the power of urban federation, who remembers the Rhenish League and the Swabian cities that once challenged his predecessors. The document specified that elections must take place in Frankfurt am Main, and this specification too serves Charles's purpose, fixing the site of future choice in a city that lies within the sphere of his influence. Coronations were to occur in Aachen, at the throne of Charlemagne, and this continuity with the imperial past lends legitimacy to the present arrangement, the new law clothed in the garment of ancient practice. The Elector of Mainz, as Arch-Chancellor of Germany, would preside over elections and summon the other electors, and this precedence of the ecclesiastical prince reflects the hierarchy that Charles wishes to preserve, the churchly authority lending its sanction to the secular process. If Mainz was vacant, Trier would preside. If both were vacant, Cologne, and this chain of succession ensures that the ceremonial order will persist even through death and transition, that the machinery of election will not stall for the absence of any single man. The electors were to meet within 3 months of a king's death and decide by majority vote, and this provision removes the uncertainty that has plagued previous successions, the long interregnums during which the empire lacked a head and the princes lacked a centre. The bull fixed the number of electors at 7, neither more nor less, and this fixation was itself a kind of magic, the number becoming law, law becoming number, the stability of the digit promising the stability of the realm. You are walking through the streets of Nuremberg as evening falls, and the cold has deepened into stillness. The merchants have closed their stalls, and the shutters of the houses are barred against the night. Around you, the city settles into its winter rhythm, the ordinary life that continues beneath and around the great events of state. You feel the cobblestones through the thin soles of your shoes, the irregularity of the paving that has been laid and relayed across 2 centuries of traffic. The smell of cooking fires comes from the windows above, the ordinary hunger of ordinary people who will live and die without ever hearing the name of the Golden Bull, yet whose lives will be shaped by its provisions across the centuries to come. The physical production of 7 copies has been ordered, 6 with golden seals distributed to the electors, and the imperial archives, and you imagine the scriptoria where the copyists work through the winter months, their lamps burning late into the darkness. You feel the weight of the golden seal in the hand, heavier than ordinary lead seals, that weight which is the weight of law made tangible, the precious metal declaring the preciousness of the document it authenticates. The seals are affixed with ribbon of silk, the wax impressed with the dyes that bear the imperial image, and each copy becomes a physical presence of the law, a thing that can be held and displayed and sworn upon. The months pass, and the winter yields to spring with the slow reluctance of these northern lands. You are standing in a garden where the first green is pushing through the soil, and the air carries the smell of turned earth and rain. Around you, the birds have begun their morning songs, and the light has changed its quality, the low winter sun giving way to the higher arc of April. You are here, in the empire of Charles IV, in the year 1356, and you are also elsewhere, in the sleep that deepens, in the warmth that holds you as the narrative continues its slow unfolding. The summer comes, and with it the movement of the imperial court from city to city, the peripatetic monarchy that has no fixed capital but makes its presence felt through visitation and display. You are in a market square as the court passes through, and you see the riders in their livery, the baggage carts with their canvas covers, the servants who run ahead to prepare each night's lodging. The dust rises from the wheels and settles upon the stalls, and the merchants pause in their bargaining to watch the procession, their faces showing that mixture of interest and calculation with which ordinary people observe the movements of power. The autumn returns, and the leaves fall upon the roads that lead to Metz, where Charles has determined to complete what Nuremberg began. The Christmas Day promulgation at Metz, 6 months after Nuremberg, completing the legal framework, and you are there in the cathedral precinct as the day approaches, feeling the particular quality of December light, the pale diffusion that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, the sun low and distant behind the clouds that have settled over the Moselle Valley. The frost-rimed windows of the Metz Cathedral chapter house show patterns of ice that shift and change with the temperature, each morning a new design drawn by the cold upon the glass. You are standing in the nave of the cathedral, and the stone around you has been warmed by centuries of candles, by the breath of congregations, by the accumulated presence of devotion. The pillars rise into darkness, their capitals carved with leaves and figures that you can barely distinguish in the dimness. Around you, the faithful have gathered for the Christmas Mass, and their voices join in the responses with the automatic certainty of practice, the words spoken so many times that they have become part of the body rather than the mind. The cold air moves across your face from the open door, and you turn to see the imperial party entering, Charles in his robes of state, the electors surrounding him in the order that the Nuremberg lawbook has established. Christmas bells in Metz mingle with the imperial trumpets, and the sound is neither sacred nor secular, but something between, the two musics meeting and merging in the space of the cathedral. You feel the vibration of the great bells in your chest, the low frequencies that the ear barely registers but the body knows. The trumpets answer with their brighter voices, their metal tubes flashing in the candlelight, and the assembly turns from the altar to witness the completion of what began in January's cold. The Metz portion, chapters 24-31, addressed coronation ceremonies and other matters, and the notary reads these provisions with the same steady voice that pronounced the earlier chapters, but with a difference that you can hear, a slight relaxation of tempo, as if the reader too feels the approach of completion, the satisfaction of a structure brought to its close. The coronation ceremonies are described in detail, the anointing, the oath, the enthronement upon the stone that Charlemagne himself occupied, and you understand how Charles is binding past to future, making his own reign and his son's reign part of a continuity that stretches back to the great emperor of the Franks. The Latin of the Metz chapters has the same formality, the same precision as the Nuremberg text, the same care for distinction and definition. You observe the faces of the electors as they listen, the archbishops in their mitres, the secular princes in their ducal crowns, and you see in their expressions that mixture of satisfaction and vigilance with which men regard a settlement that gives them much, but also binds them, that elevates them, but also fixes them in a role from which they cannot depart. The light in the chapter house comes from windows set in the eastern wall, and the morning sun, when it breaks through the December clouds, strikes the lectern where the notary stands and illuminates the parchment with a brightness that seems to come from within rather than without. You are here in Metz, on the 25th day of December, in the year 1356, and you are also elsewhere in the sleep that holds you, in the warmth that is the body's own remembering of summer against the cold that the narrative brings. The 7 copies are complete, the 6 with golden seals distributed to the electors and the imperial archives, and you imagine the hands that will receive them, the princes who will place them in their coffers, the archivists who will catalogue them among the accumulated records of centuries. The immediate recognition of the Golden Bull as the empire's fundamental law comes not from any single proclamation, but from the accumulation of reference and citation, the gradual incorporation of its provisions into the practice of courts and chanceries across the German lands. You are in a scriptorium years later, perhaps decades, and a clerk is copying a charter that cites the bull as authority, his pen moving across the page with the steady rhythm of a man who writes what he does not question. The ink is the same oak, gall, and iron, the parchment the same prepared skin, and the continuity of materials speaks the continuity of law, the persistence of forms that outlast the hands that make them. The winter deepens around Metz, and the Moselle freezes at its edges, the ice extending from the banks toward the center of the stream in fingers that meet and merge in the coldest nights. You are walking along the riverbank, and the cold air moves across your face with a sharpness that brings tears to the eyes, that clarity of extreme temperature in which every detail of the world seems etched and distinct. Around you, the bare branches of the willows make patterns against the pale sky, their thin twigs catching the last light in a network of silver and grey. The empire of Charles IV continues in its vastness, from the Baltic to the Adriatic, from the Rhineland to the borders of Poland and Hungary, and you are present in its extent, in the multiplicity of its landscapes and peoples, the sleep that carries you moving as the court moves, from city to city, from season to season. You are here in the year 1356, and you are also elsewhere in the warmth that memory provides, in the stillness that is the body's own recording of what the mind has attended. The years accumulate their weight, and the Golden Bull of 1356, the Nuremberg Lawbook of 10 January 1356, and the Metz Lawbook of 25 December 1356, become the foundation upon which later generations build their understanding of the empire, the text that students copy in the universities, that jurists cite in their opinions, that chronicles record as the great achievement of Charles's reign. You are in a library centuries hence, and a scholar turns the pages of a manuscript, his finger tracing the lines of a document that has outlived the empire it was written to sustain, that persists as words upon parchment when the political structure it defined has dissolved into other forms, other arrangements of power and territory. The document was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage document in 2013, and this recognition, too, is part of the history that the narrative unfolds, the modern world acknowledging what the medieval world made, the continuity of valuation across the ruptures of time. You are here, in the presence of this text, in the sleep that is also a kind of witness, the body's own recording of what the mind has attended and will in its time return to, transformed by the restorative absence of consciousness. The water moves, the light changes. The Golden Bull of 1356 remains, in its 7 copies, in its 6 golden seals, in the archives where it rests, and the minds where it lives as knowledge, as the shape of a particular moment in the long making of law and empire, of the structures that humans build to outlast themselves, that persist in their persistence, in their weight, in their slow unfolding through the centuries, that the sleep of one night cannot measure, but only touch, briefly, in the dream that is also history, the history that is also dream. The frost upon the windows has melted, or perhaps it was never there. Perhaps the frost was only the image that the narrative required, the cold that makes the warmth felt, the distance that makes the presence known. You are here, and you are elsewhere, and the elsewhere is the here of sleep, the present that contains all presence, the warmth that holds the cold within itself as memory, as the body's own recording of what the mind has attended. The water moves. The light changes. The Electoral College assembled in Frankfurt in the autumn of 1612, and you are standing in the antechamber of the Archbishop of Mainz, where the morning light falls through tall windows onto maps spread across a walnut table. The Rhine mist rises at dawn around the walls of Mainz, softening the edges of towers that have watched over this river junction since Roman soldiers first pitched their tents on the left bank. You feel the damp chill of October air moving through gaps in the leaded glass, and the scratch of quills in cathedral chapter archives echoes from somewhere deeper in the palace, recording elections and privileges as scribes have done for centuries. The Archbishop of Mainz held the highest rank among all electors as Arch-Chancellor of Germany and President of the Electoral College, a precedence rooted in claims that stretched back through the mists of Carolingian restoration to the missionary zeal of Saint Boniface in the mid-8th century. The ancient origins of the 3 seas, all claiming foundation in Roman or early Carolingian times, shaped their competing narratives of legitimacy like river channels carved through limestone over millennia. Mainz asserted its primacy through Boniface's martyrdom and burial, through papal letters and imperial privileges that accumulated in its cathedral treasury like sediment along a fertile floodplain. Trier countered with bolder claims, maintaining that its episcopal line descended directly from Saint Maternus in the 3rd century, making it the oldest see north of the Alps, a city where Roman basilicas still stood as witnesses to uninterrupted Christian witness across the imperial centuries. Cologne, youngest in this triad of ancient foundations, nevertheless possessed the relics of the 3 Magi, brought from Milan in 1164, around which it constructed a cult of pilgrimage that drew wealth and attention from across Latin Christendom. You are walking now through the undercroft of Trier's Cathedral, where the damp stone of Roman cellars beneath the Archbishop's palace presses against your shoulder, cool and faintly mineral, the masonry courses still bearing the tool marks of builders who worked under Constantine's gaze. Incense lingers in Cologne Cathedral long after Mass has ended, and you breathe its ricinous memory as you move through the twilight spaces of the choir, where vaulting dissolves upward into shadow. The gradual accumulation of electoral rights through the 12th and 13th centuries transformed these spiritual offices into powers that shaped the destiny of kingdoms, each privilege won through negotiation, crisis, and the careful cultivation of imperial favor. The archbishops were elected by their cathedral chapters, creating a complex system of ecclesiastical and political election that made each vacancy an occasion for maneuver among canons who held their own patents of nobility, their own networks of kinship and patronage. Mainz's territory, Kurmainz, existed as an independent prince-bishopric from the mid-10th century until 1803, its boundaries shifting with the fortunes of war and diplomacy, while its core identity remained anchored in the Rhine gorge, and the fertile plains of Thuringia. You are standing on the terrace of the Electoral Palace at Aschaffenburg, watching vineyard terraces on the Moselle slopes, their autumn colours reflected in the river, though this view belongs to Trier's domain far to the west, and your imagination must carry you there across the intervening ridges of the Hunsrück. The Archbishop of Trier held the office of Arch-Chancellor of Gaul and Burgundy, a title that echoed with the memory of Frankish kingdoms divided and redivided across centuries of dynastic struggle. Trier's position on the Moselle gave it control of important wine-producing regions and river tolls, and you can almost taste the Riesling pressed from grapes grown on those steep inclines, the labor of generations etched into every terrace wall of broken slate. All three archbishops were imperial princes with secular jurisdiction over their territories, not merely spiritual leaders, a duality that required them to maintain armies, administer justice, and play the dangerous game of territorial expansion that consumed the resources and attention of their secular counterparts. You are sitting in the chapter house at Cologne, where the scratch of quills marks the election of a new archbishop, the canons deliberating behind closed doors while messengers wait in the courtyard with letters from the Pope, from the Emperor, from every prince with interest in the outcome. The contrast between spiritual vocation and worldly power manifested in palaces, armies, and territorial ambitions that would have astonished the apostolic fishermen, whose successors these prelates claimed to be. The ecclesiastical electors could not found dynasties, but they accumulated enormous wealth and built magnificent courts, spending their revenues on architecture, music, scholarship, and the elaborate ceremonial that displayed their standing to rivals and allies alike. Cologne's territory, Kurköln, was the largest and wealthiest of the three ecclesiastical electorates by the 16th century, its scattered possessions stretching from the lower Rhine into Westphalia, its revenues supplemented by the tolls of the busiest commercial waterway in northern Europe. The Archbishop of Cologne held the office of Arch-Chancellor of Italy, a title that connected him to the ancient heartland of empire, even as his actual authority there remained ceremonial, symbolic, a thread of legitimacy woven through the fabric of imperial pretension. You are moving through the state apartments at Bonn, where tapestries depict the triumph of the church over heresy, and the damp stone of Trier's Roman cellars seems to call to you from below, reminding you that all this magnificence rests upon foundations laid in other centuries, for other purposes, by hands that knew nothing of electoral privilege. The three ecclesiastical electors were traditionally allied in the Rhenish electoral group, their common interests as prelates of the Rhine Valley often outweighing their individual rivalries when faced with threats from secular princes or papal interference. The Golden Bull confirmed that no elector could be excommunicated during an election, protecting churchmen from papal interference, a provision that recognized the practical reality that spiritual weapons must not disrupt the constitutional machinery of imperial succession. Mainz's primacy was expressed in the right to summon elections and to anoint the elected king, a ceremonial role that carried profound symbolic weight and no small measure of actual influence in the critical hours when a new ruler was made. You are standing in the Coronation Chapel at Aachen, where the Rhine mist rises at dawn around the walls of Mainz in your memory. For the archbishop must travel here to perform the sacred rite that transformed an elected king into an anointed emperor, the chrism still warm from the altar lamp as it touches the brow of the man who would rule Christendom's temporal sword. The cathedral chapters as power brokers, electing archbishops who balanced papal, imperial, and local interests, shaped the character of these ecclesiastical principalities more profoundly than any single prelate's personality or ambition. The scratch of quills in cathedral chapter archives records the deliberations of men who understood that their choice would determine the course of policy for decades. For archbishops served until death, and a young man elected to one of these sees might outlast 3 emperors and 4 popes. Cologne's archbishop was also traditionally one of the empire's greatest feudal lords, with extensive vassal networks that extended his influence far beyond the boundaries of Kirköln itself, binding knights and minor princes in obligations of service and counsel that multiplied his effective strength. You are riding through the Westphalian countryside in early spring, the mud of the road spattering your horse's flanks, as you carry dispatches from the Archbishop of Cologne to his vassal the Count of Mark, and the vineyard terraces on the Moselle slopes, their autumn colours reflected in the river, seem impossibly distant, a memory of another season, another landscape, another rhythm of life. The rivalry between Mainz and Habsburg interests became particularly acute in the 16th and 17th centuries, as the archbishops of the Rhine sought to preserve their autonomy against a dynasty that increasingly treated the imperial office as family patrimony. This position made the Archbishop of Mainz the natural leader of any opposition to Habsburg pretension, the figure around whom discontent could crystallize into constitutional resistance. Mainz's survival through the Reformation, through the 30 Years' War, through the shifting alliances of the age of Louis XIV, testified to the resilience of its institutional structures and the skill of its rulers in navigating treacherous political waters. You are standing in the library at Mainz, where the Rhine mist rises at dawn around the walls outside your window, and the volumes on these shelves contain the accumulated wisdom and cunning of centuries of electoral diplomacy, the letters and treatises and secret agreements that preserved this small state's independence against empires. The particular magnificence of the Cologne court under Archbishop-Elector Gebhard Truchsess von Wollberg in the late 16th century exemplified both the possibilities and the perils of ecclesiastical princely power. Gebhard's conversion to Protestantism in 1582, his marriage to Agnes von Mansfeld-Eisleben, and his attempt to transform Cologne into a hereditary secular duchy precipitated a crisis that demonstrated how fragile the constitutional compromise of ecclesiastical statehood could become when personal conviction clashed with institutional obligation. You breathe the incense now as you imagine the cathedral in the months of controversy, the canons meeting under armed guard, the papal nuncio pressing for excommunication, the Protestant princes of the Rhineland watching to see whether a new secular power might emerge in their midst. The Arch-Chancellor title of Italy passed to another prelate after Gebhard's fall, another man who would respect the boundaries that Gebhard had transgressed, the unwritten rules that kept the ecclesiastical electors within the fold of Catholic Europe. The damp stone of Trier's Roman cellars speaks of deeper continuities, of institutions that survived because they adapted, because they learned to contain the personal within the structural, the charismatic within the bureaucratic. Kurtria was centered on the ancient Roman city on the Moselle River, and its archbishops governed a landscape where every hillside bore the marks of Roman viticulture, every river crossing the remains of imperial engineering. The title of Arch-Chancellor of Gaul and Burgundy connected Trier's prelate to a Frankish past that predated the empire itself, to the Merovingian kings who had made Trier their capital before Paris rose to prominence. You are walking through the Porta Nigra in the hour before sunset, the sandstone warm against your palm, and the vineyard terraces on the Moselle slopes glow in the angled light, like tapestries hung in the nave of some outdoor cathedral. The scratch of quills records the qualifications examined, the promises extracted, the oaths sworn before the first ballot was cast, each candidate vetted for his ability to protect the chapter's privileges, to advance its members' careers, to maintain the delicate equilibrium among pope, emperor, and territorial estates. This dual character required the archbishops to be trained in law and administration, as well as theology, to command troops as well as to celebrate Mass, to judge disputes over inheritance and boundary, as well as to absolve sin. You are attending the opening of the Reichsgemergerate at Wetzlar, where the Rhine mist rises at dawn around the walls of Mainz in your thoughts, for the archbishop's representative sits among the assessors, his scarlet robes marking his presence in this highest imperial court. The Golden Bull's protection acknowledged that the spiritual electors needed special shelter precisely because their position was most vulnerable to the weapons of their own religious order. Kirköln's scattered possessions required constant travel and supervision, its revenues supporting a court that set the standard for ecclesiastical magnificence in the German lands. You are moving through the gallery at Bruchel, where portraits of Cologne's archbishops line the walls in chronological succession, and the damp stone of Trier's Roman cellars seems to whisper that all this display rests upon older, humbler foundations, upon the faith of fishermen and tent-makers that somehow transmuted into the power of princes. Men who occupied this position understood that they were not merely participants in imperial governance, but its very embodiment, the living connection between the empire's present and its Carolingian origins. You are standing in the electoral chapel at Mainz, where the Rhine mist rises at dawn around the walls outside, and the light through the east window falls on the chair from which the archbishop presided, its wood worn smooth by the hands of men who sat here across 9 centuries of elections and anointings. The ancient origins of the 3 sees provided the ideological framework within which their constitutional privileges were defended and extended, each archbishop a steward of traditions that predated the empire he served. You are riding through the Burgisches land in high summer, the beech forests dark on the ridges above, and the vineyard terraces on the Moselle slopes seem to belong to another world entirely, though both landscapes owe their political identity to the same archiepiscopal authority. The title of Arch-Chancellor of Gaul and Burgundy gave Trier's prelate, standing in the western regions where Habsburg and Valois, later Bourbon, interests collided, a position that required careful navigation between powers that could crush his small principality should he choose wrongly. The cathedral chapters as power brokers ensured that these principalities remained responsive to their particular constituencies, even as they participated in imperial governance. The scratch of quills records not merely elections, but the ongoing negotiation of privilege, the compilation of customary law, the registration of agreements that define the boundaries of archiepiscopal power within each territory. The Arch-Chancellor title of Italy required Cologne's archbishops to maintain an Italian orientation in their diplomacy, to cultivate relationships with Roman families and papal curia that their Rhineland location might otherwise have neglected. You are moving through the archives at Cologne, where incense lingers long after Mass has ended, and the documents in their leather bindings carry the dust of centuries, the accumulated record of how one small state maintained its place in the great world. The 3 archbishoprics controlled strategic positions on the Rhine, the empire's most important commercial artery, and this geographical fact shaped their economic development, their military concerns, their very understanding of their role in the imperial system. The merchants who loaded and unloaded their cargoes along these riverbanks lived under archiepiscopal law, paid archiepiscopal tolls, sought justice in archiepiscopal courts. You are walking through the fish market at Mainz in the hour after sunrise, the cobblestones wet with river mist, and the Rhine mist rises at dawn around the walls of Mainz as it has done across the centuries of recorded history, a constant in the midst of all that has changed. Gebhard's attempt to secularize his archbishopric failed not because of personal inadequacy, but because the constitutional and religious framework of the empire could not accommodate so fundamental a breach of established order, because the other electors understood that their own positions depended upon maintaining the categories that Gebhard sought to dissolve. Kirköln's recovery from the Gebhard crisis testified to the resilience of its institutions, the capacity of its cathedral chapter and territorial estates to contain disruption and preserve continuity. You are standing in the restored chapel at Bonn, where the portrait of Gebhard's successor, Ernst of Bavaria, hangs above the altar, and the vineyard terraces on the Moselle slopes seem to promise that the rhythms of nature persist through all human conflict and resolution. The complex system of ecclesiastical and political election distributed power among multiple actors and prevented the concentration of authority that might have tempted imperial or papal intervention. The solidarity of the Rhenish electoral group expressed a shared interest in preserving the constitutional equilibrium that gave them influence disproportionate to their territorial extent. You are attending a meeting of the three archbishops at Koblenz, where the Rhine and Moselle converge, and the damp stone of Roman cellars seems present in the very air. For this meeting at the confluence of rivers symbolizes the convergence of interests that binds these prelates together. The contrast between spiritual vocation and worldly power required constant attention, constant expenditure, constant negotiation with neighbors whose secular status freed them from some of the constraints that bound ecclesiastical princes. The absence of hereditary succession meant that each reign began anew with the education and formation of a man who might come from any of the noble houses of Catholic Europe. Kermainc's survival through so many centuries of religious and political upheaval testified to the skill of its rulers in adapting to circumstances while maintaining the core of their institutional identity. You are standing in the garden at Aschaffenburg, where the Rhine mist rises at dawn around the walls of Mainz in the distance, and the formal plantings of box and yew express an ordered vision of nature that mirrors the archbishop's ordered vision of society, each element in its place, each path leading to its predetermined destination. The charter myths of sacred beginnings endowed the privileges of the three seas with an aura of divine sanction. The precedence of Mainz was justified by reference to Boniface's mission, to the papal privileges of the 8th century, to the continuous tradition of archiepiscopal leadership that supposedly connected the present to that distant sacred past. The gradual accumulation of electoral rights transformed these historical claims into constitutional realities, each privilege won through specific negotiation, each precedent established in response to specific crisis, until by the time of the Golden Bull, the position of the three ecclesiastical electors had become so entrenched that only revolutionary upheaval could dislodge it. You are moving through the cathedral at Mainz, where the scratch of quills echoes from the scriptorium above, and the light through the clerestory falls in long shafts across the nave, illuminating the tomb of a medieval archbishop whose effigy wears both mitre and sword, the symbols of his dual authority. Courtrier's archbishops found themselves caught between Habsburg claims to imperial supremacy and French claims to influence in the Rhineland, their small principality a buffer that required constant diplomatic attention to preserve. The Archbishop of Trier held you standing at the harbour at dawn, where the Moselle River carries mist between ancient stone walls, and the last bells of Trier fade into the hills behind you. The Archbishop of Trier held one voice among 7, yet the secular electors carried offices that shaped the daily spectacle of empire. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of wine and cloth, their voices low in the cold air, and you turn northward now, toward the Rhine and the Palatinate, where another prince waited with his stewardship and his feasts. The Count Palatine of the Rhine held the office of imperial steward and was responsible for imperial banquets. This duty fell upon the senior lay prince of the empire, the man who would stand at the right hand of the emperor when the great occasions demanded display. The Palatinate's capital at Heidelberg became one of the most celebrated courts of the German Renaissance, a city where Italian architects and Dutch humanists mingled with German jurists and French poets. You are walking now through the gardens of Heidelberg Castle in the year 1550, and the red sandstone of the castle glowing in afternoon light casts long shadows across the terraces where princes once strolled with philosophers. The Oththenrichsbau rises beside you, its arcades and gables the work of a prince who believed that knowledge and beauty were the proper companions of power. Oththenrich, Elector Palatine from 1556 to 1559, completed this wing of the castle with a speed that astonished his contemporaries, and he filled its halls with the collections that would form the kernel of the Bibliotheca Palatina. The echo of horses' hooves in the courtyard reaches your ears as grooms exercise the electoral mounts, their iron shoes striking sparks from the cobblestones in the thin morning. Around you, the scholars of the Palatinate move between lecture halls and libraries, their black gowns rustling against the stone, and the cold air moves across your face with the scent of river water and printer's ink. The cultivation of humanist learning at Heidelberg attracted men from every corner of Europe, from Hungary to Scotland, from Poland to Spain, and their conversations in Latin echoed through the taverns and the college halls. The Palatinate passed to the Wittelsbach family in 1214 and remained with them until 1777. This long tenure shaped the region's identity in ways that outlasted any single prince or policy, embedding the electoral title in the very soil of the Middle Rhine. The Wittelsbachs divided their lands repeatedly, but the electoral Palatinate remained a distinct territory, a core of authority that could not be fragmented without imperial consequence. You are sitting now in the library of the castle, where the Bibliotheca Palatina holds thousands of volumes in chained rows, their leather bindings warm with the afternoon sun that falls through tall windows. The dust moves in the light, each mote a tiny world suspended in the silence between readings, and somewhere a scholar turns a page with the careful reverence of a priest at altar. Frederick V of the Palatinate, the Winter King of Bohemia, lost his electoral dignity to Bavaria in 1623. This catastrophe, born of his acceptance of the Bohemian crown and his defeat at the White Mountain, remade the electoral college for a generation. The Bavarian Wittelsbachs received a new electoral title in 1623, temporarily creating 8 electors where 7 had stood since the Golden Bull. Yet this innovation, this disruption of ancient number, could not endure beyond the wars that spawned it, and the Palatinate would eventually recover its voice, though never its former preeminence. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of paper and type from the river barges, and the cold air moves across your face with the smell of ink and binding glue. You are riding now through the Elbe marshes around Wittenberg, fog-bound in autumn mornings, where the willows stand like ghost sentinels along the watercourses. The Duke of Saxony held the office of Imperial Marshal, responsible for overseeing tournaments and military display. This duty brought him to the field when the empire mustered its strength, his heralds crying the challenges and his officers measuring the ground for the joust. Saxony's electoral dignity was originally attached to the territory of Saxe-Wittenberg, not the larger Wettin lands, a distinction that would shape the destiny of central Germany for centuries to come. The Ascania dynasty of Saxe-Wittenberg died out in the male line in 1422, and their extinction opened a contest that would redraw the map of power. In 1423, King Sigismund granted the duchy and electoral dignity to Frederick the Belligerent of the Wettin family. This act transformed a marcher lord from the eastern frontier into one of the empire's greatest princes, attaching the golden electoral seal to territories far beyond the ancient Kerkrays. The Wettins already held extensive territories in Meissen and Thuringia, making the electoral title apply to much larger domains than the original Saxe-Wittenberg had commanded. You are standing now in the market square of Wittenberg, where the fog still clings to the cobblestones and the first lamps are lit in the upper windows. The Saxon electoral territory was specifically designated as the Kerkrays, the former Saxe-Wittenberg lands, a legal precision that preserved the memory of the older Scania realm even as the Wettin power swallowed it in practice. The Wettin acquisition of Saxony demonstrates how the electoral system could absorb and redirect the energies of rising dynasties. Frederick the Belligerent, called so for his martial temperament and his endless feud with his neighbours, received from Sigismund not merely a title, but a place in the constitutional fabric of the empire. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of grain and salt from the river boats, their lanterns swinging in the damp air, and the cold air moves across your face with the smell of rotting leaves and distant smoke. The Elbe marshes around Wittenberg, fog-bound in autumn mornings, have witnessed the passage of armies and the preaching of reformers, their waters reflecting both the pageantry of electors and the humble boats of fishermen. You are walking now through the sandy heath of the Brandenburg Mark, pine-scented and sparsely inhabited, where the soil grows thin and the villages stand far apart. The Margrave of Brandenburg held the office of Imperial Chamberlain, responsible for the imperial bedchamber. This intimate duty, the preparation of the emperor's private quarters, carried a symbolism that transcended its practical simplicity, placing the Margrave in the very household of the supreme prince. Brandenburg was relatively poor and thinly populated in the 14th and 15th centuries, its sandy soils refusing the dense cultivation of the Rhineland or the Elbe Valley. The pine needles soften your footsteps as you move between the scattered settlements, and the cold air moves across your face with the resinous scent of the forest and the distant call of a woodcutter's axe. Brandenburg's slow transformation under the Hohenzollerns, who acquired the Margraviate in 1415, would eventually remake this unpromising territory into the kernel of a great power. Frederick of Hohenzollern, Burgrave of Nuremberg, purchased the Margraviate from Emperor Sigismund and began the long work of consolidation that his descendants would continue for centuries. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of timber and tar from the river barges on the Havel, their voices carrying across the water in the stillness of the afternoon. The sandy heath of the Brandenburg Mark, pine-scented and sparsely inhabited, would one day support the capital of a unified Germany. But in the 15th century, it remained a land of modest estates and careful husbandry, its marshes undrained and its forests largely untouched. You are climbing now toward the heights of Prague Castle, where the Bohemian crown jewels, their gems catching candlelight, await the coronation of a new king. The King of Bohemia held the office of imperial cupbearer, the highest ceremonial rank after the arch-chancellors. This distinction recognized the unique position of the Bohemian monarch within the imperial constitution, his kingdom standing apart from the duchies and margraviates that surrounded it. Bohemia was the only kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire and enjoyed special status, its ruler crowned with his own regalia and seated on his own throne in the great cathedral of St. Vitus. The Hussite Revolution in Bohemia and its threat to the electoral system in the 1420s tested this special status as perhaps no other challenge had done. The followers of Jan Hus, burned at Constance in 1415, had transformed religious grievance into armed resistance, their armies marching under the banner of the chalice, and their songs echoing through the Bohemian hills. The Hussite Revolution raised the terrifying possibility that a heretic king might sit among the electors, his vote tainting the sacred process of imperial choice. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of silver and furs from the mountain roads, their pack animals blowing steam in the courtyard below, and the cold air moves across your face with the smell of incense and stone dust from the cathedral workshops. The Bohemian crown jewels, their gems catching candlelight, seem to pulse with the accumulated authority of centuries, their beauty a silent argument for the legitimacy of the crown they adorned. The Golden Bull specified that if Bohemia was vacant or held by a non-Catholic, his vote would pass to the Count Palatine. This provision, inserted by Charles IV with characteristic foresight, provided a mechanism for preserving the electoral college's integrity while acknowledging the fragility of religious conformity. You are standing now in the great hall of the castle, where the electors once feasted, and where the diets of Bohemia debated the fate of kingdoms. The echo of horses' hooves from distant courtyards reaches you even here, a memory of other courts and other ceremonies, and the cold air moves across your face with the draught from tall windows that look toward the Moldau and the distant hills. The red sandstone of Heidelberg Castle glowing in afternoon light belongs to another world, yet the same sun that warms those Rhineland walls now sets behind the spires of Prague, gilding the statues of saints and kings. The Leipzig division of 1485, how the Wettin lands split, with the Ernestine line keeping the electoral dignity and much of the territory. This partition, agreed between the brothers Ernest and Albert after the death of their father Frederick II, divided the Wettin inheritance into two principal lines while preserving the electoral dignity for the elder branch. You are walking now through the streets of Leipzig in the autumn of that year, where the negotiators have gathered in the town hall and the markets overflow with the harvest of a peaceful season. The Elbe marshes around Wittenberg, fog-bound in autumn mornings, lie to the north, and the thought of that territory, with its university and its electoral title, must weigh upon the minds of the princes who bargain here. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of cloth and spices from the fair wagons, their voices a constant murmur beneath the gabled roofs, and the cold air moves across your face with the smell of roasting chestnuts and fresh bread. The Ernestine line, descended from the elder brother, retained the Kirkrays and the electoral voice, while the Albertine line received the more prosperous territories of Meissen and the south. This division seemed reasonable to contemporaries, a prudent arrangement that preserved both dignity and substance for the competing branches of the family. Yet the very precariousness of the Ernestine holdings, their concentration in the original electoral lands, would prove their undoing when religious conflict came to test the loyalties of German princes. You are sitting now in a Leipzig tavern, where the negotiators drink their wine and the fire crackles in the stone hearth, and the cold air moves across your face each time the door opens to admit another messenger from the princely chambers. The Wittenberg capitulation of 1547, how the Albertine Wettins gained the electorate from their Ernestine cousins. This reversal, born of the Schmalkaldic War and the changing religious alignment of the empire, transferred the electoral title to the very branch that had once been denied it. Maurice of Saxony, Albertine duke and secret ally of the emperor, received the Kirkrays and the electoral dignity as reward for his betrayal of the Protestant cause he had outwardly supported. You are standing now in the streets of Wittenberg, where the imperial commissioners read the new dispensation and the old elector John Frederick languishes in captivity. The Elbe marshes around Wittenberg, fog-bound in autumn mornings, seem to mourn the passing of an order that had lasted since 1423, their waters reflecting the grey sky of a defeated season. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of books and theological pamphlets from the university presses, the trade uncertain in the new political climate, and the cold air moves across your face with the smell of damp paper and printer's solvent. The Bohemian crown jewels, their gems catching candlelight, seemed distant now, yet they too had known usurpation and restoration, their history as tangled as that of any German principality. You are riding now through the pine forests of the Mark, where the Hohenzollern Margraves have begun their long work of improvement. The Hohenzollerns brought with them from Franconia the habits of careful administration and the arts of territorial consolidation, their burgravial experience in the service of the emperor translating into margravial authority in the northeast. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of fish and salt from the Baltic trade, their boats tied at the wharves of Berlin and Köln, and the cold air moves across your face with the sharpness of northern waters. The Palatinate passed to the Wittelsbach family in 1214 and remained with them until 1777. This long tenure, longer than any other electoral dynasty would manage, gave the Palatinate a stability that weathered even the divisions and the religious conversions of the Wittelsbachs. You are standing now in the great hall of Otthenrich's palace, where the red sandstone of Heidelberg Castle, glowing in afternoon light, falls across the terracotta tiles and the painted ceilings. The echo of horses' hooves in the courtyard marks the passage of another courier, another visitor from the wider world of imperial diplomacy. This loss, though temporary in the longer perspective, demonstrated how the electoral system could be manipulated by victorious emperors to punish rebellion and reward loyalty. This inflation of the electoral college, like the debasement of coinage, threatened to devalue the very institution it purported to honor. This provision, never invoked in the manner Charles IV perhaps anticipated, nonetheless shaped the self-understanding of the Palatine electors, confirming their place as the senior lay princes of the empire. You are walking now through the streets of Heidelberg once more, where the Bibliotheca Palatina still holds its treasures, and the scholars still dispute in the shadow of the castle. The cultivation of humanist learning at Heidelberg had made this city a beacon, its light visible from Paris to Vienna, from London to Rome. This duty, seemingly ceremonial, carried with it the power to include and exclude, to honor and to humble, through the subtle arrangements of seating and precedence. You are standing now in the kitchen offices of an imperial coronation, where the preparations for the great feast consume the attention of hundreds. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of peacock and swan, of sugar sculptures and Rhenish wine, their contributions to the spectacle of empire carefully catalogued and stored. The cold air moves across your face from the cellar openings, where the barrels rest in ordered rows, and the red sandstone of Heidelberg Castle glowing in afternoon light seems very distant from this bustle of practical necessity. The Duke of Saxony held the office of Imperial Marshal, responsible for overseeing tournaments and military display. This duty brought him to the lists when the empire celebrated its warrior identity, his heralds proclaiming the rules and his officers ensuring the fair conduct of the joust. You are sitting now in the stands of a tournament ground, where the banners of the participating knights flutter in the breeze and the sand of the lists has been carefully raked and watered. The Margrave of Brandenburg held the office of Imperial Chamberlain, responsible for the imperial bedchamber. This intimate service, the preparation of the emperor's private quarters, placed the Margrave in a relationship of personal proximity that transcended the formal distance of constitutional rank. You are standing now in a modest hunting lodge in the Mark, where the Hohenzollern Margrave rests between progresses through his scattered domains. The King of Bohemia held the office of Imperial Cupbearer, the highest ceremonial rank after the Arch-Chancellors. This precedence recognized the unique dignity of the Bohemian crown, the only royal title within the empire's complex hierarchy of princes. You are walking now through the Cathedral of St. Vitus, where the Bohemian crown jewels, their gems catching candlelight, have been displayed for the veneration of subjects, and the instruction of visitors. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of wax and candles from the river stairs, their contribution to the maintenance of this sacred illumination, and the cold air moves across your face with the smell of burning tallow and ancient stone. The Ascania dynasty of Saxe-Wittenberg died out in the male line in 1422. Their extinction, like the earlier disappearance of other princely houses, created the vacancy that Sigismund would fill with his grant to Frederick the Belligerent. You are riding now through the Thuringian forests, where the Wettin castles command the passes, and the villages owe their allegiance to a dynasty suddenly elevated among the greatest of the land. The Saxon electoral territory was specifically designated as the Kerkreis, the former Saxe-Wittenberg lands. This legal precision, preserving the territorial definition of the electorate even as the dynastic power expanded beyond it, would become crucial in the partition of 1485 and the transfer of 1547. This settlement, negotiated in the commercial prosperity of the Leipzig Fair, seemed to secure the future of both branches while preserving the constitutional integrity of the electoral system. You are walking now through the market streets of that city, where the division has been proclaimed and the merchants resume their ordinary business. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of furs and amber from the northern trade, their voices raised in the customary haggling, and the cold air moves across your face with the first snow of the approaching winter. The Wittenberg capitulation of 1547, how the Albertine Wettins seized the electorate from their Ernestine cousins. This reversal, accomplished by force and imperial favor, would shape the religious and political development of Saxony for generations to come. The Albertine line, once excluded from the electoral dignity, now possessed it, and their court at Dresden would gradually eclipse the cultural significance of Wittenberg, even as the university maintained its theological prestige. You are standing now on the bridge over the Elbe at Wittenberg, where the imperial banners proclaim the new dispensation and the old elector's supporters have fled or submitted. The Elbe marshes around Wittenberg, fog-bound in autumn mornings, receive the smoke of burning documents and the echoes of changing power, and the cold air moves across your face with the ashes of a defeated cause. The Palatinate passed to the Wittelsbach family in 1214 and remained with them until 1777. This endurance, this persistence through division and reunion, Catholic and Protestant, prosperity and disaster, marks the Palatinate as the most stable of the secular electorates, its Wittelsbach lords shaping its character across 6 centuries of imperial history. The sealed letters of summons depart from the Archbishop's palace in Mainz on a grey morning in early February. You are standing in the courtyard as the couriers mount their horses, each leather satchel bearing the archiepiscopal seal and the formal Latin phrases that will set 6 princes in motion. The Archbishop of Mainz, as convener of the imperial election, has prepared these documents with the care of a man who understands that the fate of kingdoms rests upon parchment and wax. The Golden Bull mandated that elections occur in Frankfurt am Main, which would become a free imperial city in 1220, and now that ancient provision transforms quiet roads into arteries of power. The couriers ride north toward Brandenburg, east toward Saxony and Bohemia, south toward the Palatinate and the Rhineland archbishoprics, their hooves scattering the last snow of winter across the cobblestones. Around you, the morning air carries the mineral scent of the Rhine, that broad river flowing past Mainz with the indifference of deep water moving toward distant seas. The sky above the palace is the color of old pewter, heavy with moisture that has not yet resolved itself into rain. Pigeons settle upon the courtyard walls, their grey wings folding with soft percussion against the damp stone. A stable boy leads the last courier's horse through an archway, and the animal's breath rises in visible clouds, that linger briefly before dissolving into the general humidity of the morning. Somewhere beyond these walls, a blacksmith begins his day's work, and the rhythmic striking of iron upon iron provides a counterpoint to the departing hooves. The Archbishop of Mainz watches from an upper window, his figure barely visible behind leaded glass that distorts the world into segments of light and shadow. The first letter reaches Heidelberg 10 days later, delivered to the Palatine Elector in his castle above the Neckar Valley. Each elector travelled with an elaborate entourage appropriate to his rank and dignity, and the Palatine court now swells with the activity of preparation. Cooks, falconers, musicians, secretaries, guards in livery of scarlet and gold, all must be assembled and provisioned for the journey down the Rhine. The elector himself reviews the inventories in his chamber, his finger moving down columns of figures that represent barrels of wine, sacks of flour, cured hams, and the countless necessities of a prince travelling in state. You are standing at the harbour below Heidelberg Castle as the barges are loaded for departure. The creak of river barges on the Rhine current fills the morning with wooden complaint and the strain of ropes against bollards. The river stretches north and south in a grey-green ribbon, its surface disturbed by small waves that catch the pale light of an overcast sky. Mists rise from the water where it meets the colder air, creating veils that drift across the banks and obscure the willows that lean toward the current. A heron stands motionless at the water's edge, its grey plumage rendering it nearly invisible against the muted colours of the riverside. The smell of tar and hemp mingles with the damp earthiness of the bank, and somewhere upstream a dog barks with the persistence of an animal who has scented something interesting in the reeds. The Palatine flotilla moves downstream with the current, past castle after castle that crown the heights of the Rhine gorge. You're watching from the deck of the lead barge as the fortress of Pfalzgrafenstein appears on its island, its hexagonal towers rising from the water like a stone ship frozen mid-voyage. The elector's standard flutters from the masthead, and the oarsmen pull in steady rhythm, their bodies leaning into each stroke with the practiced economy of men who have spent their lives upon this river. The cliffs above the water display strata of geological time in bands of ochre and grey, their surfaces softened by winter vegetation that clings to every ledge. The journey could take weeks depending on weather, road conditions, and political circumstances, but the river road offers the Palatine court a passage of relative speed and comfort, the current doing much of the work that horses would strain to accomplish upon muddy tracks. The light changes as afternoon progresses toward evening, the low sun finding gaps in the cloud cover to illuminate stretches of the river with a pale golden quality that reflects from the water in shifting patterns. You are leaning against the rail as the barge passes through a stretch where the current narrows between basalt outcrops, and the water speaks with a different voice here, a low murmur of resistance and flow. The castles on the heights have begun to light their evening lamps, small points of warmth against the darkening stone. Fishermen in small boats pull their nets with steady motions, their catch of Rhine salmon and eels destined for markets in Cologne and beyond. The creak of river barges continues through the gathering dusk, now accompanied by the splash of oars and the occasional call of a helmsman navigating by memory of the channel's deeper water. Meanwhile, far to the northeast, the Saxon elector has already departed Wittenberg, his entourage struggling through roads that winter has rendered nearly impassable. You are standing at the edge of the Thuringian forest as his carriage appears through the bare trees, its wheels sinking into ruts filled with brown water and half-frozen mud. Hoarfrost on the forest roads, horse's breath steaming in morning air, marks the passage of this princely company through a landscape still held in winter's grip. The elector has chosen to travel by road rather than risk the longer water route through Hamburg and the North Sea coast. and now his decision exacts its cost in delay and discomfort. Dignity here means horses straining in harness, coachmen cursing softly as they apply whips with restrained violence, and the slow grinding of wheels against stone and frozen earth. The forest surrounds the road with a density of oak and beech that has not yet begun to show the swelling buds of approaching spring. You are walking behind the Saxon carriage as it labors up a slope where the road has been cut into the hillside, the exposed earth showing bands of clay and gravel in the excavation. The air smells of leaf mold and the particular sharpness of evergreen needles, a scent that intensifies as the sun's weak warmth begins to release the volatile oils of the forest floor. Each morning repeats this pattern, the ground too frozen to absorb the moisture that falls as mist and settles as rime upon every surface. The electors' guards ride ahead and behind, their cloaks dark with the damp, their faces showing the stoic patience of men who have learned that discomfort is the constant companion of duty. A village appears where the road descends toward a stream, its half-timbered houses clustered around a mill whose wheel turns with the slow deliberation of cold machinery. You're watching from the churchyard as the Saxon party halts for refreshment, the elector descending from his carriage with the stiffness of a man who has spent hours in confined space. A woman emerges from the inn with bread and salt, the traditional offering to travelers of rank, and her curtsy reveals the worn wooden step of a building that has received many such processions. The miller's boy stares at the Saxon livery with the wide eyes of one who will remember this day through a long life of ordinary labor. The Brandenburg Margrave's journey exceeds all others in distance, his sandy plains lying far to the northeast, where the empire fades into Slavic lands. You are standing in the courtyard of his castle at Berlin as the preparations for departure enter their final phase. The Margrave's entourage assembled with the particular care of a prince who knows that his remoteness must be countered by magnificence. The Margrave reviews his cavalry escort, their horses bred on the northern grasslands, to a stamina that will be tested upon roads that grow worse with every mile southwestward. The landscape of Brandenburg reveals itself in the flatness of glacial plains, its sandy soil supporting forests of pine that stretch toward horizons unbroken by significant elevation. You are riding with the Margrave's vanguard as it crosses a heath where the vegetation has been burned in the traditional management of pasture, the blackened stems emerging from pale sand like the remains of some forgotten catastrophe. The sky here seems larger than in the southern lands, its dome extending to touch the earth at distances that weary the eye with emptiness. The wind carries the resinous scent of the pines and the occasional sulfuric hint of marshland where the drainage has failed. The Brandenburg party includes hunters who will provision the march from the abundant game of these wastes, their dogs loping beside the column, with tongues lolling in canine contentment. A ford across a sluggish river requires the dismantling of baggage wagons, their contents transferred to rafts, while the horses swim the channel with men clinging to their manes. You are standing waist-deep in water that carries the brown stain of peat, feeling the current's insistent pressure against your legs as you guide a pack horse toward the farther bank. The cold of this water penetrates wool and leather with the thoroughness of northern spring, and your hands upon the bridle have lost their fine sensitivity to texture, aware only of the animal's nervous energy transmitted through taut leather. The Margrave himself crosses in a boat that has been poled from the nearest village, his figure wrapped in furs against a wind that has strengthened with the afternoon. The Bohemian king's retinue moves by a different route, and in a different spirit, his procession the largest and most exotic that the imperial election will receive. You are standing in the streets of Prague as the preparations reach their climax, the royal stables disgorging horses of Hungarian and Turkish breeding. their caparisons displaying the lions and eagles of Wenceslaus's complex heraldry. Imperial cities and foreign powers sent observers to report on the proceedings, and already the Bohemian court swells with Italian secretaries, French musicians, and the agents of powers who understand that this king's influence upon the imperial throne will shape their interests for a generation. The electors were to assemble within 3 months of a king's death, though this was often delayed, and Wenceslaus has calculated his departure to arrive with theatrical precision, neither too eager nor too negligent of the summons. The road from Prague descends through the Bohemian forest toward the Saxon border, a passage of mountain and valley that reveals the geological complexity of this ancient kingdom. You are walking beside the royal carriage as it descends a switchback where the road has been cut into the hillside, the drop to the valley floor measured in hundreds of feet of empty air. The Bohemian king's impressive retinue stretches behind this leading vehicle in a column that fills the road for half a league, its progress marked by the varied colors of livery from a dozen courts and principalities. Falcons in wicker cages sway upon poles carried by dedicated servants, their hooded heads turning with the curiosity of predators who sense the altitude's thinness. The air smells of the resinous forests that climb the slopes above and the mineral springs that break from the rocks below, a combination that identifies this landscape to the experienced traveler. A customs post at the border requires the negotiation of passage, the local officials emerging from a wooden building to examine the royal credentials with the punctiliousness of minor functionaries confronting greatness. You are watching from the royal coach as Wenceslaus himself leans forward to speak with these men, his Czech dialect softening into the Saxon inflection that bridges these neighboring lands. The border guards' faces show the transformation from suspicion to awe that the presence of true royalty effects, their bows deepening as comprehension dawns. The Bohemian procession flows across this frontier like a river breaching a minor dam, its volume and momentum carrying all before it. While the electors converge upon Frankfurt from their various directions, the city itself has entered upon months of preparation that transform its ordinary life. You are standing in the council chamber of the Römer as the city fathers review their preparations, the long table covered with maps and lists, and the correspondence of magistrates who have spent years awaiting this responsibility. The city council of Frankfurt prepared for months, repairing roads, stocking food, and decorating public spaces, and now the final phase of this labor approaches with the certainty of spring after winter. The costs of hosting an election fell heavily on Frankfurt, though the prestige was considered worth the expense, and the ledgers before these men record expenditures that would purchase the annual revenue of lesser cities. The Römerberg, central square of the city's civic life, receives the attention of workmen who erect the temporary structures that will frame the ceremonial arrival of princes. You are watching from the balcony of a merchant's house as scaffolding rises against the familiar silhouette of the Römer itself, the city's town hall transformed by banners and the installation of platforms where dignitaries will observe the processions. The distant hammering from carpenters provides a percussive accompaniment to the ordinary commerce of the square, where farmers still bring their produce and housewives their shopping. Rain on the cobblestones of the Römerberg, torches hissing in sudden showers, will feature in the memories of those who witness these arrivals, for March upon the main brings weather of capricious temper that respects no ceremonial calendar. The tanning quarter of Frankfurt, situated where the river's dampness supports this ancient craft, exudes its characteristic atmosphere into the broader air of the city. You're walking through streets where hides hang in the open, their processing releasing ammoniac vapors that catch at the throat and moisten the eyes. The smell of Frankfurt's tanning quarter, unavoidable even for princely nostrils, will greet the electors as they enter from the western gates, an olfactory reminder that this free city maintains its commercial functions regardless of imperial dignity. Workers in leather aprons move among the vats with the practiced movements of men who have absorbed this atmosphere into their very pores, their hands stained with the tannins that preserve and transform animal skin into the material of shoes and harness and the bindings of books. Security concerns transform the ordinary openness of Frankfurt's life into something more guarded and suspicious. You are standing upon the city walls as the watch changes, observing the patrols that now scrutinize every approaching figure with heightened attention. Security was paramount. The city walls were manned, and foreign merchants sometimes temporarily expelled, a measure that protects the electoral process from the intrigues that foreign powers might attempt through their commercial agents. The electors and their retinues will be housed in Frankfurt's finest inns, monasteries, and private palaces, but first they must be identified and admitted through gates that have been strengthened against any unauthorized entry. The guards' halberds gleam with fresh oil against the grey stone of the fortifications, their points catching the pale light of an afternoon that promises rain before evening. The Archbishop of Mainz traditionally lodged in the Dominican monastery near the election site, a provision that acknowledged his role as convener and his need for proximity to the cathedral where the election would ultimately occur. You are walking through the cloister of this monastery as preparations advance for the reception of its distinguished guest, the cells of brothers, reassigned to accommodate the archiepiscopal secretaries and the servants who manage a prince's daily necessities. The secular electors often stayed in patrician houses or city palaces near the Römerberg, their locations determined by the complex calculus of precedence and alliance that governed every aspect of electoral politics. The Palatine electors' flotilla reaches the Mainz confluence and turns eastward into the narrower channel that leads toward Frankfurt itself. You are standing at the river landing as the first barges appear, their decks crowded with the personnel and possessions of a court in motion. The creak of river barges on the Rhine current has given way to the different sounds of a river port preparing to receive distinction. The calling of dockmen, the adjustment of mooring ropes, the formal announcements that precede any princely landing. The elector appears at the rail of his vessel, his figure still wrapped in travelling cloak against the river's chill, and his face shows the fatigue of days upon the water mixed with the alertness of a man who knows that his arrival begins a new phase of competition. The elector's arrival was staged as a ceremonial procession, each displaying his coat of arms and retinue, and the Palatine entry into Frankfurt follows this protocol with the precision of long rehearsal. You are standing among the crowds that line the route from the river gate to the Römerberg, your view framed by the shoulders of citizens who have claimed their positions hours before the expected passage. The Palatine standard moves at the head of the column, its Wittelsbach lion displayed in gold upon a field of black, and behind it the elector rides a white horse caparisoned in scarlet. The period before the election was filled with banquets, private meetings, and diplomatic maneuvering, and the Palatine elector's arrival initiates this phase of intense social and political activity. You are standing in the courtyard of a patrician house as the elector dismounts, his host emerging to offer the formal welcome that precedes days of negotiation conducted over excellent wine and the refined cuisine that Frankfurt's position as a trade center makes possible. Servants pass with ewers of water for the traveller's refreshment, their movements choreographed by household officials who have prepared for this moment with the same attention that the city council devoted to roads and walls. The Saxon elector arrives 3 days later, his journey through the Thuringian forest having consumed the time that the Palatine court spent upon the Rhine. You are standing at the eastern gate as his carriage appears, its mud-splashed exterior bearing witness to the roads that have conveyed it hither. The crowd's reception is respectful but less exuberant than that given the Palatine, for Saxony's role in imperial politics carries a different weight than the Rhineland's ancient connection to Roman grandeur. The Brandenburg Margrave's arrival occurs at evening, his column entering through the northern gate as the light fails and torches become necessary. You are standing in the street as his escort passes, the clatter of hooves upon cobblestones announcing a military presence that distinguishes this elector from his more ceremonious colleagues. The Bohemian king's entry provides the climax of these arrivals, his procession designed to overwhelm the visual memory of all who witness it. You are standing upon a temporary platform erected for the observation of this passage, the Römerberg dense with citizens and visitors who have gathered despite the threatening weather. The Bohemian king's impressive retinue extends beyond the immediate visibility of the square, its tail still entering through the western gate as its head reaches the cathedral precinct. The torches that have been prepared for evening use now flare against the premature darkness of the storm, their light reflecting from wet stone and polished armor with a theatrical intensity that seems almost calculated. The Golden Bull specified that the electors must appear in person or send properly accredited representatives, and now 4 of the 7 have gathered in Frankfurt's constrained space, their physical presence confirming the validity of the process they have joined. You are walking through streets that have become a tapestry of competing liveries, the colors of great houses displayed upon servants and guards who jostle for precedence in narrow medieval ways. The Archbishop of Mainz arrives last, his journey from his own city being the briefest, but his role the most consequential. You are standing in the Dominican cloister as his entourage enters, the prior and brothers, assembled to receive their distinguished guest with the formalities that his spiritual and temporal authority commands. The afternoon light enters the Kaisersaal through tall windows set high in the Gothic walls, and you are standing near the southern corner where the electors will gather, watching dust motes drift through pale gold beams that fall across the stone floor in long, steady rectangles. The Römer, Frankfurt City Hall, served as the traditional site of imperial elections from at least the 14th century, and this room has witnessed the slow transfer of power across generations whose names have faded into the portraits that watch from every wall. Around you, the portraits of emperors create a visual lineage of legitimate authority, their painted eyes following the movement of servants who arrange the 7 carved chairs in their precise order of precedence. You feel the particular acoustic of Gothic halls as your own footsteps echo on stone floors, each sound swallowed and returned by vaulting that has heard centuries of whispered ambition. The wax drips from ceremonial candles in brass holders positioned between the windows, pooling in slow, translucent layers that will be scraped clean before the electors arrive. A door opens somewhere beyond your sight, and the rustle of heavy brocade reaches you before the man himself appears, an attendant adjusting the fall of his sleeve as the Archbishop of Mainz enters through the smaller western door. He pauses beneath a portrait of Charlemagne, and you notice how the afternoon light catches the embroidery on his cope, the thread of gold repeating the crosses that mark his dual authority as Archbishop and Arch-Chancellor of Germany. This proximity to the election site has allowed him to oversee the final preparations for the assembly that his letters have summoned across the winter roads. The slow assembly in the Kaisersaal begins with the arrival of servants who carry cushions and small tables, arranging them with the precision of men who know that deviation from tradition might invalidate what is to come. You move to stand beside the tall window as the second elector enters, the Archbishop of Trier, his face showing the fatigue of a longer journey through the Rhineland valleys where ice still clings to the shadowed banks. The electors sat in a specific order of precedence, Mainz presiding, then Trier, Cologne, Bohemia, Palatinate, Saxony, Brandenburg, and you watch as Trier's attendant confirms the placement of his chair, the second from the center, turned slightly toward the presiding seat. The particular acoustic of Gothic halls carries their low conversation to your corner, words blurred by distance into a murmur that rises and falls like water. More footsteps echo on stone floors as the Archbishop of Cologne arrives, the third in precedence, his entourage larger than the others because his temporal territories demand a greater show of armed presence. You observe how the three ecclesiastical electors acknowledge one another with the slight inclination of heads that preserves hierarchy while recognizing shared interest, their brocade vestments rustling as they shift in their carved chairs during the brief negotiation over seating angles. The Römer has seen this choreography repeated across centuries, yet each performance carries the weight of unique circumstance, the particular candidates and crises that have drawn these 7 men to this chamber. The afternoon light through the Kaisersaal's tall windows shifts across Cologne's shoulder as he settles, dust motes swirling in the disturbed air. The secular electors arrive with less ceremonial accompaniment but greater material display, the King of Bohemia entering with a hardness in his bearing that speaks of frontier wars against the Ottoman advance. You are standing near the brass holders where wax drips from ceremonial candles, and you notice how Bohemia pauses before the portrait of Sigismund, his own ancestor, the painted face younger than any living memory of the man. The rustle of heavy brocade marks his movement as he takes the 4th chair, the first of the secular princes, his servants withdrawing to the wall with the silence of men accustomed to proximity without presence. The particular acoustic of Gothic halls makes his sigh audible, a small sound of settling, of accepting the weight that this room imposes upon all who enter it. The Count Palatine follows, then the Duke of Saxony, then the Margrave of Brandenburg, each arrival diminishing the space between ceremony and exhaustion, the long journeys written in their careful movements. You watch dust motes in sunbeams as Brandenburg, the last to arrive, stands before his appointed chair and looks slowly around the Kaisersaal, his gaze touching each portrait, each elector, each candle flame as if committing the scene to memory against some future need. Now all 7 are present, the chairs filled with the particular combination of men who will decide the empire's fate for this generation. The afternoon light has moved across the floor to touch the edge of the central carpet, and the rustle of heavy brocade subsides into stillness. The oath-taking begins with Mainz rising from his chair, the movement drawing every eye as he takes from an attendant a copy of the Gospels bound in leather, darkened by the hands that have held it across previous elections. You are standing where you can see each elector's hand on the Gospels, swearing to choose without corruption, the words in Latin falling into the particular acoustic of Gothic halls with a resonance that seems to come from the walls themselves. The elector of Mainz administered an oath to each elector, swearing to choose the most worthy candidate without bribery or external pressure, and you watch Trier's face as he speaks the formula, the slight tension around his eyes that might be concentration or might be the memory of promises already made in other chambers, far from this formal light. The wax drips from ceremonial candles in brass holders near your elbow, each drop a small, hot assertion of time's passage. Cologne follows, his voice steadier, the practiced cadence of a man who has administered oaths as often as he has sworn them. You feel the afternoon light through the Kaisersaal's tall windows warming the stone beside your shoulder as Bohemia steps forward, his hand large on the gospel cover, the words emerging with the slight hesitation of a man more accustomed to Czech and German than to the Latin that proceedings were conducted in, the language of imperial diplomacy. The portraits of emperors seem to lean forward in their frames, the visual lineage of legitimate authority pressing upon the living men who seek to add another name to their company. The rustle of heavy brocade accompanies each movement back to chair, the electors shifting in their carved chairs with the small adjustments of men settling into prolonged stillness. The Palatinate's oath is quick, almost hurried, and you notice how Saxony glances toward him as if reading something in the tempo of those familiar words. You are standing in the hush that follows each sworn promise, watching dust motes in sunbeams that now reach nearly to the center of the chamber, the light touching the empty space where no candidate stands, where the absent presence of those who seek this office fills the room with unspoken names. Brandenburg is last, his voice the lowest, the particular acoustic of Gothic halls carrying his words with a weight that seems to come from the north, from the Mark's sandy soil and its long border with the pagan wilderness. The wax drips from ceremonial candles, pooling in brass holders that catch the afternoon light in small molten mirrors. The private deliberations begin with the withdrawal of all attendants, the doors closing with a solidity that you feel in your chest before you hear it, the particular acoustic of Gothic halls making the latch fall like a stone into deep water. You remain, as you have remained in every chapter of this history, the invisible witness that the narrative requires, and you feel the cold of the stone wall through your clothing as the 7 men are left alone with the portraits and the dust motes and the slow settling of their own breath. The Römer has witnessed this exclusion even of servants across centuries, the recognition that the moment of choice must be stripped of all external witness to preserve the fiction of unpressured deliberation. The afternoon light through the Kaisersaal's tall windows has begun to fade toward the amber of late day, and the rustle of heavy brocade marks the first shift in position, someone crossing his legs, someone else adjusting the fall of his chain of office. Mainz speaks, his voice low, the Latin formal and unhurried, proposing that they consider first the merits of the candidates without yet naming preferences. You watch dust motes in sunbeams that have thinned as the sun descends toward the roofline of the buildings across the square, the particles now visible only in the most concentrated shafts of light. You hear in the responses the regional accents that no amount of shared education has fully erased, the Bavarian thickness in one voice, the Saxon flatness in another, the Rhineland music that carries from the 3 ecclesiastical Prince-Electors. The particular acoustic of Gothic halls returns each phrase with a slight delay, so that the room seems to answer itself, to hold conversation with its own stone memory of previous deliberations. Trier speaks next, longer than Mainz, outlining considerations of territorial security that you understand to favor one candidate without the name yet spoken. You are standing where the fading afternoon light through the Kaisersaal's tall windows no longer reaches, in the shadow that has claimed the corner where you observe, and you feel the temperature drop as the sun withdraws, the stone releasing its stored warmth slowly into the cooling air. The portraits of emperors watch from their frames with the indifference of paint and varnish, the visual lineage of legitimate authority offering no guidance for the choice that must be made by living men in this particular hour. The wax drips from ceremonial candles that have been lit against the advancing dusk, pooling in brass holders with a soft, repeated sound that marks time more insistently than any clock. Cologne breaks the emerging pattern by speaking in German, a deliberate choice that you recognize as strategic, the vernacular carrying associations of plain dealing that Latin's formality cannot convey. You feel the particular acoustic of Gothic halls change with the altered language, the harder consonants striking the stone with a different quality, and you watch Bohemia lean forward slightly in his carved chair, the first visible response to another's speech. The physical arrangement of chairs shapes the conversation, the men on either side of the center turning toward one another, the ends of the semicircle drawn inward by the gravity of decision. The rustle of heavy brocade marks another shift, a leg recrossed, a shoulder turned, the body language of men who have spent long hours in council. The private deliberations continue through the fading of the afternoon light into the grey of a Frankfurt evening, the candles becoming the primary source of illumination, their flames steady in the stillness of a chamber sealed against draught and witness. You are standing in the shadows that have claimed the corners, watching the electors' faces emerge and subside in the candlelight as each speaks, the play of illumination making them seem to appear and disappear like the dust motes that once drifted through sunbeams now vanished. The particular acoustic of Gothic halls carries a whisper from Bohemia to Palatinate, a private communication that the room returns to itself before any other can claim to have overheard. The Römer has contained such moments across the centuries of its service, the slow emergence of consensus, or its failure, the building indifferent to outcomes that reshape the map of Europe. Saxony speaks at last, his voice carrying the weight of a man who has held his counsel through hours of others' persuasion, and you notice how Brandenburg's head turns toward him with an eagerness that suggests alliance, or at least shared inclination. You feel the particular acoustic of Gothic halls as Saxony's words fall into silence, the absence of immediate response indicating that something has shifted, that the configuration of preference has reached a form that can no longer be politely ignored. The portraits of emperors seem to lean closer in the candlelight, the visual lineage of legitimate authority awaiting the addition of a new face, a new name to join their painted company. The formal casting of votes begins with Mainz rising again, the movement signaling transition from deliberation to decision, from the possible to the determined. You are standing where the candlelight reaches you at last, the electors shifting in their carved chairs to face the center, and you hear the particular acoustic of Gothic halls return his Latin with the clarity of a bell struck once in darkness. The election was by majority vote. 4 of 7 electors could choose a king, and you understand that the arithmetic has been settled in the private hours, that what follows is the public confirmation of what has already been agreed in whisper and implication. The rustle of heavy brocade accompanies each elector as he stands to announce his choice in Latin, the language of imperial diplomacy, preserving the form even when the substance has been shaped by German speech in the sealed chamber. Trier follows Mainz, his voice steady, the name emerging with the weight of a man who has considered and chosen, not merely acquiesced. You watch dust motes that have reappeared in the candlelight, tiny particles disturbed by the movement of bodies in the still air, drifting through the illumination like the spirits of the sunbeams that preceded them. You remember the oath as the names accumulate, each vote building the majority that will determine the empire's path. The wax drips from ceremonial candles in brass holders, each drop a small, hot punctuation to the Latin phrases that fill the Kaisersaal with their formal music. Cologne speaks, and you hear in his announcement a slight emphasis that suggests the claims of Rhineland proximity, the traditional association of this region with imperial authority that stretches back to Charlemagne's choice of Aachen. You feel the particular acoustic of Gothic halls as Bohemia follows, his Latin more accented than the others, but no less formal, the choice announced with the gravity of a kingdom that has its own imperial traditions, its own claim to stand apart from the German electorates that surround it. The Römer has heard these announcements across centuries, the same names recurring in different combinations, the Habsburgs gradually developing techniques to secure electoral support in advance, reducing uncertainty, making this moment more predictable than the founders of this process might have intended or desired. The Palatinate speaks, and you count the votes as they accumulate, the majority forming with the inevitability that careful preparation ensures. You are standing where the candlelight flickers slightly, a draught from some imperfect seal in the Gothic vaulting, and you watch the rustle of heavy brocade as Saxony rises to add his voice to the accumulating consensus. The portraits of emperors watch from their frames, the visual lineage of legitimate authority about to gain a new member, and you feel the particular moment when private decision becomes public fact, when the empire's future shifts from possibility to determination. Brandenburg is last, his vote making the majority certain, the arithmetic closed with a formality that acknowledges what has already been achieved. You feel the particular acoustic of Gothic halls as the Latin ceases, the silence that follows more significant than any spoken word, the room holding its breath with the electors who have spent their authority in this choice. You understand that this linguistic choice preserves the fiction of a universal empire, even as the reality fragments into territorial states, into religious divisions, into the particular interests that have shaped this vote. The afternoon light through the Kaisersaal's tall windows has long faded, and the candle flames steady as if in recognition of the moment's gravity. After voting, each elector's vote was recorded in a formal document, and the majority candidate was proclaimed, and you watch as Mainz takes from his attendant the prepared parchment, his hand steady as he writes the names in the script that will preserve this decision for the imperial archives. You are standing where you can see the ink catch the candlelight, each letter a small black assertion against the parchment's whiteness, the record that will outlast the men who made it, the building that contained them, perhaps the empire itself. The particular acoustic of Gothic halls returns the scratch of the quill with a sound like distant footsteps, the echo of history writing itself in real time. The rustle of heavy brocade marks the elector's movement to stand, to prepare for the transition from private choice to public announcement. The moment of proclamation approaches with the opening of the doors, the sudden access of sound from the corridor, beyond indicating that the excluded world has been waiting, has been holding its own breath for this emergence. You feel the particular acoustic of Gothic halls change as the seal breaks, as the chamber's isolated resonance joins with the larger space of the Römer, the stairwell, the balcony that overlooks the square where the crowd has gathered in the Frankfurt evening. The wax drips from ceremonial candles in brass holders that will be extinguished once the electors depart, their light no longer needed once the public sun of proclaimed authority replaces this private illumination. The portraits of emperors seem to settle back in their frames, their role as witnesses concluded for this generation, the visual lineage of legitimate authority awaiting the new face that will join their company. The sudden hush before the proclamation falls across the Kaisersaal with a physical presence, the electors arranged in their order of precedence, Mainz at their center with the document that records their choice. You are standing where you can see the balcony doors, the night air visible beyond them, the torches of the square casting an orange glow that replaces the absent sun. The Römer has contained this moment before, the pause between private decision and public consequence, and you feel it in your own held breath, in the stillness of the electors who have spoken their Latin and now await the world's response. The particular acoustic of Gothic halls seems to concentrate in this hush. The stone holding the silence like a cup holds water, full to the brim and trembling. Then the name echoes from the balcony to the waiting crowd, the Latin carried on the night air with a clarity that surprises you, the particular acoustic of Gothic halls giving way to the open resonance of public space, the square returning the sound with 1,000 voices that answer the single proclamation. You feel the roar from the square below as a physical pressure, the air itself seeming to compress and release with the crowd's response, whether acclamation or protest or merely the noise of thousands who have waited hours for these syllables. The newly elected king was then presented to the waiting crowd from the Römer's balcony, and you imagine him there, though he has not been in this chamber, has not sworn the oaths or heard the deliberations, the absent center of this ceremony that proceeds in his name rather than his presence. The contrast between medieval ideal and early modern reality asserts itself even in this moment of apparent tradition. the forms preserved while their content has shifted beneath them. You are standing where the candlelight meets the torchlight from the open balcony, watching dust motes that have been disturbed by the rush of air, drifting through the mixed illumination like small witnesses to a transformation they cannot comprehend. Charles V's election in 1519 was the most expensive in imperial history, with massive bribes distributed to electors, and you understand that this night's proclamation carries the weight of Fugger gold, of loans that will bind the empire to Augsburg banking houses for generations to come. The particular acoustic of Gothic halls still returns the last echoes of the crowd's roar, the building containing both the medieval form and its early modern subversion. The electors' increasing demands for payment and privileges transformed elections into elaborate financial negotiations, and you watch them now as they turn from the balcony, their ceremonial role concluded, their private accounts awaiting settlement. You feel the rustle of heavy brocade as they move toward the doors, the business of empire reduced to the mechanics of departure, of return to lodgings where further negotiations will continue through the night and the days following. The afternoon light through the Kaisersaal's tall windows has been replaced by torch and candle, and you understand that the light itself has become a metaphor for the transformation you have witnessed, the natural giving way to the purchased, the traditional to the negotiated. The election was followed by a Te Deum in Frankfurt Cathedral and public celebrations, and you follow the electors as they descend through the Römer's passages, emerging into the square where the crowd's density makes movement slow, the press of bodies carrying its own heat against the cooling night. You are standing where you can see the cathedral's tower against the stars, the destination toward which this procession moves, the religious confirmation that will follow the secular proclamation. The particular acoustic of Gothic halls gives way to the open sound of celebration, music beginning somewhere to your left, the irregular rhythm of drums, and the clearer voice of brass instruments that have learned tunes for this occasion. The portraits of emperors remain in their chamber above, the visual lineage of legitimate authority completed for this generation, their painted eyes fixed upon the empty chairs that will await the next convocation. If the election was disputed, the Golden Bull provided no clear resolution mechanism, leading to potential double elections, and you remember this possibility even in the midst of apparent consensus, the knowledge that other outcomes have occurred, other names proclaimed from other balconies in other Frankfurts of the imperial imagination. You feel the press of the crowd, the particular warmth of many bodies in motion, and you understand that this celebration contains its own tensions, the religious divisions that will complicate future elections, already present in the silence of those who do not join the Te Deum, who stand apart with Protestant reservation or Protestant exclusion. The Protestant Reformation created religious divisions among electors, complicating elections from the 1520s onward, and though this night belongs to an earlier moment, you sense the approaching shadow, the complication that will transform this ceremony into something contested, something fought over rather than negotiated. The cathedral doors receive the procession, and you stand at the threshold where the particular acoustic of Gothic halls changes yet again, the sacred space returning sound with a resonance different from the Römer's secular stone, the vaulting higher, the intention more explicitly directed toward the transcendent. You watch dust motes in the light of countless candles, the Te Deum beginning with the voices of choristers who have prepared for this night, who will sing this service regardless of the name proclaimed, regardless of the gold that purchased the voice that proclaimed it. Maximilian I was the first Habsburg to be elected without serious opposition in 1486, and you remember this precedent as the Te Deum rises toward the vault. The road from Frankfurt to Aachen unfolds before you through valleys of the Rhineland, each morning bringing the king's procession closer to the city that Charlemagne made his own. You are walking among the train of horses and litters, the dust of your passage rising slowly in the warm September air, settling upon the embroidered banners that announce the elector who has chosen to ride rather than rest within his carriage. The Golden Bull specified Aachen as the coronation city, site of Charlemagne's palace, chapel and throne, and this specification draws the newly elected king along ancient paths that his predecessors have travelled since the 14th century, fixed these rights in law. Around you, the villages gather at their edges to watch the royal party pass, their silence broken only by the occasional bark of dogs who have not been trained to ceremony. Children stand beside elders who remember the last such journey, perhaps, or who claim to remember, for the decades between coronations outlast the memory of any single generation. The king displays himself to his subjects through windows left deliberately open, his face composed in the expression of serene accessibility that counsellors have instructed him to maintain from dawn until the lamps are lit at each evening's stopping place. You feel the rhythm of this slow movement in your own legs, the ache of distance measured not in miles, but in the number of nights spent upon straw mattresses in castles borrowed from abbots and minor nobles. The Aachen coronation ritual developed over centuries, incorporating Germanic, Roman, and Christian elements, and this development shows in the very pace of your approach, which allows each tradition its moment of acknowledgement. Germanic custom demands the king's showing forth to his people, his physical presence confirming the bond between ruler and realm that no parchment can adequately seal. Roman inheritance speaks in the very road beneath your feet, the paved stretches that soldiers once marched to reach the thermal springs Aachen built its name upon. Christian devotion shapes the prayers offered at each day's beginning, the Mass heard in parish churches, whose priests have prepared for this passage, with the same care their grandfathers devoted to the coronation of the king's predecessor. You hear these masses in the distance now, the celebrant's voice carrying through open doors as your own party moves past some village where the royal train has chosen not to pause. 2 weeks or more, the entire coronation journey from Frankfurt to Aachen could take, and you understand this duration not as delay but as necessity, the realm itself requiring time to adjust to the fact of its new master. The particular coolness of Aachen Cathedral's octagon, even in summer, awaits at this journey's end. But between here and there lie fields of ripening grain and forests where charcoal burners tend their slow fires, all of it passing through your awareness with the steady accumulation that travel imposes upon the waking mind. Each evening the king receives deputations from towns too small to warrant a full day's halt, their petitions heard in torchlit courtyards while you stand among the guards, the night air carrying the smell of stables and cooking fires from the servants' quarters. The approach to Aachen itself comes gradually, the terrain rising toward the foothills where Charlemagne established his capital more than 7 centuries past. You are standing at the edge of the final camp when the spire first becomes visible against the morning sky, its silhouette familiar from seals and coins, but strange in its physical presence, larger than representation prepared you to receive. The king was first escorted to Charlemagne's throne in the octagon of Aachen Cathedral, and this escort begins with the formal entry through gates where magistrates in their robes of office await with keys presented upon velvet cushions, the symbolic surrender of civic authority that precedes the spiritual surrender of the coronation itself. The night before coronation brings you into the cathedral's keeping, the vigil observed in the chapel of St. Mary, where the king will sleep upon a bed, prepared with the linens of his royal estate. You are positioned near the entrance to this chapel, close enough to observe the preparations without intruding upon the sacred solitude that surrounds the monarch in these hours of waiting. Candles burn in patterns established by long precedent, their flames steady in the still air, and you watch the king kneel for the final prayers of his vigil, his shoulders visible beneath the simple robe of white that replaces the travelling clothes of his journey. The throne itself, constructed in the 790s, was believed to have been used by Charlemagne, though he was never crowned upon it, and this fact occupies some portion of your attention as you wait through the night hours, the silence broken only by the footsteps of clergy who move through their own devotions in adjacent chapels. From the 11th century, the throne was called the arch-throne of the whole realm in Latin sources, and this title echoes in your memory as you watch the first grey light begin to define the shapes of columns and arches around you. The worn smoothness of Charlemagne's throne, polished by the robes of 30 kings, awaits its next claimant, and you imagine the pressure of centuries upon those stone surfaces, the fabric of royal garments passing across the same seat with the regularity that water wears channels into persistent rock. The coronation mass included the king's communion and anointing with holy oil, and this anointing forms the center toward which all other ceremonies converge, the moment when divine choice confirms human election. You are standing among the witnesses when the Archbishop of Cologne enters in his vestments, the dispute with the Archbishop of Mainz resolved or suppressed for this occasion, the privilege of performance taking precedence over the privilege of claim. The Archbishop of Cologne traditionally performed the coronation, though this was disputed with the Archbishop of Mainz, and you sense this history in the careful choreography of his approach, each gesture claiming ancient right, while acknowledging the fragility of any right that requires such constant assertion. The moment of anointing arrives with the gradual unfolding that liturgical time demands, the king prostrate before the altar while prayers accumulate in layers of Latin petition. Olive oil and balsam of the chrism, its sharp scent during anointing, reaches you across the space of the octagon, the fragrance distinct from the ordinary oils of lamp and cooking, marked by its consecration for this single purpose. You watch the archbishop's fingers trace the oil on forehead and hands in the shape of a cross, the gesture deliberate and slow, each contact of sacred substance with royal flesh witnessed by eyes that will carry memory of this marking to distant parts of the realm. The physical elevation onto Charlemagne's throne follows, attendants guiding the king upward with hands that know the precise balance required, the stone seat receiving his weight with the silence of absolute acceptance. After coronation, the king received the imperial regalia, crown, orb, scepter, and holy lance, and you observe this receiving as the transformation it represents, the man becoming office through the instruments that office demands. The crown settles upon hair still damp from the oil of anointing, its weight a physical fact that the new king's neck must learn to bear without visible strain. The orb passes from consecrated hands to consecrated hands, the world it symbolizes small enough to be encompassed in gilded metal, large enough to contain the ambitions and anxieties of every soul within its boundaries. The scepter extends the king's reach in visible form. The holy lance carries its own history of victory and loss, and you watch each object assume its place in the completed figure of majesty that stands before you now, no longer merely elected but crowned, no longer merely crowned but sacred. The coronation was followed by a ceremonial banquet where each elector performed his hereditary office, and this performance begins with the procession from cathedral to hall, the route lined with those who have secured position through favor or payment, their faces turned toward the king who passes among them, transformed by the morning's rites. You are moving through corridors that connect sacred to secular space, the transition marked by changes in light, in temperature, in the quality of sound that echoes from surfaces less absorbent than the cathedral's stone. The banquet hall opens before you with the particular warmth of many bodies gathered in enclosed space, the air already carrying anticipations of the feast to come. Roast peacock, and swan at the coronation banquet, gilded and displayed before serving, occupy the central positions upon the high table, their forms preserved in death with the artifice that court kitchens command, feathers replaced or restored to create the illusion of living birds arrested in momentary stillness. You observe these displays from your position among the witnesses, the gilding catching the light from windows and torches alike, transforming food into emblem, sustenance into statement of power's capacity to transcend mere necessity. The Arch-Chancellor of Mainz served the king at table, symbolizing his highest rank, and this service takes visible form in the dish presented with the bow that acknowledges both the receiver's elevation and the presenter's own dignity, the gesture rehearsed across generations to achieve its effect of effortless propriety. The imperial steward from the Palatinate presented the first dish. The Marshal of Saxony oversaw the tournament display that would follow the banquet's conclusion, and you note these assignments as the map of power they constitute, each office a territory marked by performance rather than by boundary stone or written charter. The Chamberlain of Brandenburg held the king's basin for hand-washing. The cupbearer of Bohemia presented wine in vessels whose weight and ornament declared the importance of their contents, and you watch these ceremonies of service with attention to the precision they require, each movement a small drama of hierarchy and recognition. These ceremonial offices were hereditary and carefully preserved as marks of electoral dignity, and their preservation shows in the anxiety with which each performer executes his role, the fear of error that attends any inheritance whose value lies in proper use rather than in possession alone. The banquet proceeds through courses whose number and sequence follow patterns established before memory, each dish arriving with its appropriate accompaniment of gesture and speech, the whole forming a composition in time that mirrors the composition in space that the hall itself provides. You taste nothing, your role being witness rather than participant, but the smells of roasting and spice reach you with the persistence that appetite gives to sensory experience, the kitchen's labor translated into fragrance that fills the air between courses as well as during them. The coolness of the cathedral's octagon seems distant now, replaced by the warmth of celebration, the compression of bodies and purposes that the banquet generates around its central figure. The tournament display overseen by the Saxon marshal occupies the afternoon that follows the banquet's conclusion, the field prepared outside Aachen's walls with the care that such dangerous sport demands. The clash of lances in the tournament ground, dust rising in afternoon light, reaches you where you stand among the spectators, the sound carrying its own message of controlled violence, of force directed toward display rather than destruction. The king watches from a gallery prepared for this purpose, his position elevated both literally and symbolically above the competition that unfolds for his favor, his electors' knights competing in displays of skill and courage that honor their lords through the risk they willingly assume. You are standing near this gallery when the first course begins, horses and riders aligning at opposite ends of the lists, with the patience of performers who know their moment has not yet arrived. The dust rises in patterns that the afternoon light makes visible, each hoof's impact releasing particles that hang suspended before settling, the air itself becoming a medium in which action writes its temporary record. The clash repeats with the variations that individual skill and chance introduce, some passes ending in splintered wood and unseated riders, others in the clean passage that demonstrates perfect control of horse and weapon both. The banquet was followed by days of festivities, tournaments, and gift-giving, and you understand these days as the necessary extension of the coronation's single moment, the realm requiring time to absorb what has occurred, to adjust its understanding of itself to the fact of this new king. Gifts pass in both directions, the king's bounty establishing his capacity for generosity, the presents offered to him acknowledging his capacity to receive as the prerogative of his station. You observe these exchanges with attention to the material facts that carry symbolic weight, the falcons and horses, and jeweled objects that move from hand to hand with the regularity that ritual demands, each transfer witnessed and recorded for the memory of courts that preserve such knowledge across generations. The entire coronation journey from Frankfurt to Aachen could take 2 weeks or more, and its inverse now begins, the king's departure from the city of his crowning as deliberate as his approach, each day's progress measured against the accumulated significance of what has occurred. You are moving with this departure, the particular coolness of Aachen Cathedral's octagon, even in summer, becoming memory as the spire recedes behind you, the stone seat worn smooth by centuries of kings, left to await its next occupant in the silence that follows ceremony's conclusion. The coronation of Ferdinand I in 1531 was the last to take place at Aachen. Subsequent coronations occurred at Frankfurt due to Protestant control of Aachen, and this knowledge belongs to a future that your present cannot yet contain, the ceremonies you have observed continuing in their established forms without awareness of their approaching end. You are standing at the edge of the final tournament, the afternoon light beginning its long decline toward evening, the dust of the lists settling upon grass that will grow through the traces of this day's sport, until some future occasion calls for their renewal or their abandonment. The clash of lances continues with the persistence of tradition that does not know itself to be finite, each pass reenacting the gestures of countless predecessors while adding its own slight variation to the accumulated record. The king remains in his gallery, his figure becoming less distinct as the light shifts, and the distance between your position and his increases with the movement of the crowd. The sharp scent of chrism has faded from your awareness, replaced by the ordinary smells of dust and horse and gathered humanity that the tournament generates, the sacred fragrance belonging to the cathedral's enclosed space, rather than to this open field where secular display unfolds. Yet the connection persists in your memory, the morning's anointing and the afternoon's sport linked by the single day that contains them, the transformation of man into king finding its confirmation in the king's capacity to preside over this ancient game without apparent weariness. The days of festivities, tournaments, and gift-giving that follow the banquet extend beyond your individual witness, your own departure from Aachen occurring before the full cycle completes, your road leading elsewhere while the coronation's consequences continue to unfold. You carry with you the images that observation has stored, the particular coolness of Aachen Cathedral's octagon, even in summer, available to your recall with the freshness that significant experience preserves against time's ordinary erosion. You are walking now upon a road that leads away from this center, your steps carrying you toward futures that the coronation has helped to shape without determining, the realm's new king moving in parallel upon his own longer road toward the exercise of power that ceremony has prepared, but cannot perform. The night settles around your traveling camp with the particular darkness that open country allows, stars visible in patterns that navigators have named, and peasants have used for the timing of agricultural tasks across uncounted generations. You lie upon your own straw mattress, the particular coolness of Aachen Cathedral's octagon, even in summer, replaced by the warmth of your own body beneath rough blankets, the transition from witness to sleeper gradual enough that memory continues its work of ordering experience into coherent form. The clash of lances persists as rhythm without image, the sound of impact translated into the pulse of blood through your own veins, the tournament's controlled violence becoming the body's ordinary movement toward rest. You sleep without dreaming, or without memory of dreams. The coronation's long day finding its completion in the darkness that heals the distance between what has been witnessed and what will be recalled. The morning brings its own continuity, your road continuing while Aachen recedes into the geography of experience, its name joining the names of other places where significant events have occurred and passed. For now you walk in silence, the particular coolness of Aachen Cathedral's octagon, even in summer, available only to inward sense, the stone seat worn smooth by centuries of kings, present in your body's memory, as a texture without temperature, a weight without mass, a permanence that your own passage through time cannot claim. The king moves elsewhere upon his own road, his transformed status visible to those who encounter his progress, the crown's weight still new upon his head, the oil's anointing still recent upon his skin. You will not see him again, or if you see him it will be at distance, through crowds, across spaces that his sacred character now forbids you to approach with the proximity that ceremony temporarily allowed. For now Aachen remains what you have seen, the octagon's particular coolness, the throne's worn smoothness, the sharp scent of chrism, the dust of tournament, and the weight of regalia, all of it gathered into the single experience that your presence has made possible, your witness contributing its infinitesimal portion to the collective memory that sustains ceremony across the generations that individual lives cannot span. You are walking into autumn now, the road from coronation to ordinary time stretching before you with the length that all returns to daily existence require. The spectacular moment finding its completion in the gradual resumption of tasks that continue without reference to kings or their crowning. You are standing in the draughty great hall of a Rhineland castle in the autumn of 1273, where the electors have gathered to choose a king after the long interregnum that followed the death of Frederick II. Around you, the stone walls weep with cold moisture, and the torches throw uncertain light against tapestries depicting scenes from the lives of earlier emperors. The air smells of wet wool and old smoke. Through the high windows, you can hear the wind moving through the bare branches of oak trees in the castle yard below, and somewhere a dog barks once, then falls silent. The electors have settled upon a compromise that satisfies no one entirely, which is the nature of most compromises worth making. Rudolf of Habsburg, Count of the Aargau, and a man of modest territorial holdings in the Swiss Marches, will receive their votes. You watch as he rises to acknowledge the choice, his face lined with the weathering of 60 years, his hands scarred from the tournament and the hunt. The Habsburg name has been spoken aloud in this context for the first time, and the sound of it lingers in the vaulted space like a note held too long. The morning after the election breaks pale and still, with frost whitening the courtyards and the breath of horses rising in visible clouds. You walk through the outer bailey, where grooms are already preparing mounts for the journey south, and the iron of horseshoes rings against stone. A scribe sits hunched in a doorway, copying the electoral agreement onto parchment that will travel to the papal court for confirmation, his quill making the soft scratching sound that accompanies the making of lasting records. The Habsburg eagle, Rudolf's chosen device, appears on the seal that will authenticate this document, its wings spread in the conventional posture of imperial pretension, though Rudolf himself holds no imperial title, only the royal one that the electors have granted him. The eagle will multiply across seals and coins in the centuries to follow, gradually displacing older heraldry from the visual memory of the empire. But here in this courtyard, it is merely one symbol among many, newly stamped, and not yet worn smooth by handling. Rudolf I was elected king in 1273, establishing his family's long association with imperial office, though the association he founded would require 2 centuries of patience before it became the monopoly that history remembers. You follow the new king's entourage as it winds through the Alpine passes toward his southern territories, and the sound of cartwheels on frozen ruts accompanies your descent into the valley of the Inn. The mountains rise in their immense indifference, their peaks already holding snow that will not melt before spring. In the villages you pass through, peasants stand in doorways to watch the procession, their faces showing nothing, their hands buried in the folds of rough clothing against the cold. Rudolf is already turning his attention toward the Duchy of Austria, whose last Babenberg duke had perished without heir in 1246, leaving a prize that had tempted stronger claimants than this elderly count from the north. The Habsburgs acquired the duchy through Rudolf's machinations, through marriage and threat, and the careful exploitation of rivalries that more powerful princes had not troubled to understand, though he never held the imperial title that would have made the acquisition unassailable. The winter settles over the Danube Valley with its customary heaviness, and you find yourself in the court at Vienna as Rudolf consolidates his hold on this unexpected inheritance. The palace smells of resin from the fresh-cut pine that lines the walls against the damp, and of the spiced wine that circulates in ceramic cups among the officials who are learning to call themselves Habsburg servants. Through the tall windows, the Danube moves past in its brown silence, carrying ice southward toward the Hungarian plain. The Habsburg eagle appears now on the coins struck in the mints of Austria, displacing the older devices that had proclaimed Babenberg rule, and merchants in the market square handle these new pieces with the incurious acceptance that greets all changes in the medium of exchange. The gradual displacement of older heraldry continues in small increments. A seal here, a coin there, the slow visual accumulation of a new dynasty's presence in the material world. The years pass with the slowness that medieval time permits, and you move forward through the centuries, as through rooms in a house grown gradually unfamiliar, each chamber holding different light, different air. The Habsburg possession of Austria becomes a fact that subsequent generations do not question, embedded in the legal memory of the empire like a stone in a wall that has settled into its mortar. The Golden Bull of 1356, issued long after Rudolf's death, confirms the electoral constitution without disturbing the territorial gains that his family has accumulated, and the copies of this document preserved in electoral archives begin their long accumulation of dust, still legally binding, increasingly irrelevant to the actual distribution of power that the empire has become. The dust falls slowly, invisibly, in the silence of rooms where documents are stored and rarely consulted, marking the passage of years in places where human attention has moved elsewhere. The 15th century opens with the empire fragmented among competing jurisdictions, the imperial office weakened by the long absence of effective royal authority in Italy, and by the rise of territorial princes who govern their lands with diminishing reference to any central power. You are standing in the cathedral at Frankfurt in March of 1438, where the electors have again assembled to choose a king, and the cold stone under your feet holds the chill of winter that has not yet released its grip. The incense rises in thin columns toward the vaulted ceiling, and the voices of the choir rehearsing somewhere in the recesses of the building reach you as a distant murmur without distinct words. Albert II, Duke of Austria and a Habsburg by direct descent from Rudolf I, waits among the princes who have come to participate in this ancient ceremony. Albert was the first Habsburg elected king in 1438, beginning an almost unbroken succession, and the moment when this monopoly became established arrives without fanfare, without any single dramatic gesture that might mark it for memory. The election proceeds according to forms that the Golden Bull prescribed, the electors casting their votes in the established order, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier and Cologne preceding the secular princes of the Palatinate, Saxony, Brandenburg and Bohemia. You watch from the shadow of a pillar as Albert receives the acclamation, his face composed in the expression of grave acceptance that the occasion demands, and the torchlight catches the jewels of his ring as he raises his hand in the gesture of blessing that follows election. The Habsburg eagle appears on the banner that is unfurled to proclaim the result to the crowds waiting in the square outside, and the sound of trumpets penetrates the thick walls with a muffled brilliance. From 1440 to 1740, with one brief exception, every Holy Roman Emperor was a Habsburg, and the almost unbroken succession that Albert inaugurated will stretch across 3 centuries of European history, though no one present at this ceremony can comprehend the duration of what they have initiated. The spring that follows brings its customary transformation of the landscape around Frankfurt, and you walk through meadows where the first flowers are pushing through soil that has known only frost for months. The Rhine moves past in its green abundance, carrying the meltwater of alpine snows toward the North Sea, and the willows along its banks have begun to show the yellow-green of earliest leaf. Merchants on the river roads discuss the election with the practical interest of men who must calculate how a new king will affect their tolls and their safe conducts, and the coins that change hands in their transactions increasingly bear the Habsburg device that has become familiar through sheer repetition. The electors repeatedly chose Habsburgs because they offered a compromise acceptable to competing factions, a family whose territorial base lay conveniently distant from the centers of princely rivalry, whose very foreignness to the Rhineland and the north made them acceptable to all precisely, because they threatened non-exclusively. The decades of the 15th century give way to the 16th, and you find yourself in a world transformed by the slow earthquake of religious division. The Protestant Reformation divided the electors religiously. Saxony, Brandenburg, and the Palatinate became Protestant, while the 3 ecclesiastical electors remained Catholic, as did Bohemia until 1619, and the ancient constitutional body that chose emperors became a forum for confessional antagonism that no procedural tradition could contain. You are standing in the market square at Wittenberg on an autumn morning in 1517, though the famous theses have not yet been posted, and the air smells of the nearby tanneries and of the coal smoke that rises from hundreds of domestic fires. The university church looms at the edge of your vision, its spire catching the low sun, and students pass through the mud of the streets with the abstracted gait of young men whose attention is fixed on texts and disputations. The Habsburg lands in Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary gave them resources no single elector could match, resources that would sustain their claim to the imperial office even when their religious allegiance alienated the Protestant princes who had once found them convenient. The Reformation settles across Germany with the unevenness that marks all great transformations, some territories embracing the new teachings with revolutionary enthusiasm, others clinging to the old faith with the tenacity of communities that see their entire way of life threatened. You move through this landscape of religious division as through a forest where the path divides repeatedly, each fork leading to different clearings, different atmospheres of belief and practice. The imperial diet replaced the electoral college as the main forum for imperial politics in the 16th century, and the great assemblies at Worms, Augsburg, and Speyer become the stages on which the religious drama of the empire is performed, while the electors' formal gatherings for the choice of kings grow less frequent as the Habsburg succession becomes increasingly automatic. The electors gradually lost real political power, becoming ceremonial figures in a Habsburg-dominated system, their ancient constitutional role preserved in form while its substance drained away through the slow leakage of decades. The autumn mists rise from the white mountain battlefield, where Frederick V's hopes dissolved, though this event still lies in the future as you stand in the library of Heidelberg Castle in the early years of the 17th century. The silence that will fall after the Bibliotheca Palatina is carried to Rome, as spoils of war has not yet descended over these rooms, and the air smells of parchment and leather and the particular dust that accumulates where books are stored in quantity. You run your fingers along the spines of volumes that represent one of the great collections of European learning, and the afternoon light enters through windows of stained glass, casting colored rectangles across the reading desks where scholars bend over their work. Frederick V, the young Elector Palatine, who will become known as the Winter King, has not yet accepted the crown of Bohemia that will destroy his house and send this library into exile. The mists over the White Mountain still wait in the future, gathering in the valleys that you cannot see from this sunlit room. The year 1619 arrives with violence, as years often do when old structures crack under accumulated pressure. You are in Prague for the coronation that will not last, the Hradčany rising above the city in its ancient magnificence, the Moldau moving past in its summer fullness. The Protestant nobles of Bohemia have rejected the Habsburg Ferdinand and offered their crown to Frederick of the Palatinate, and the young elector has accepted this dangerous gift with the enthusiasm of a man who believes that fortune favors the brave. The election of Frederick V as King of Bohemia in 1619 challenged Habsburg control and helped trigger the 30 Years' War, though his rule collapsed within months and the war continued for 3 decades, its causes and character evolving far beyond its origins. You watch as Frederick processes through the streets of Prague, the crown of Bohemia heavy on his head, the cheers of the crowd rising around him with the desperate enthusiasm of people who know that their moment of defiance cannot last. The winter comes early that year, and you follow the Winter Kings caught through the shortening days toward the catastrophe that awaits. The Bohemian nobility who supported his election discover that their enthusiasm does not translate into the military resources necessary to resist the Habsburg counterattack, and the mercenary armies that might have defended their revolution demand payment that the impoverished kingdom cannot provide. The silence of Heidelberg's library after the Bibliotheca Palatina was carried to Rome as spoils of war still lies in the future, but you can feel its approach in the anxious consultations of Frederick's advisers, in the letters that travel southward seeking aid that will not arrive in sufficient quantity or time. The mists over the White Mountain battlefield gather in the valleys outside Prague, as the Habsburg army approaches under the command of Tilly and Bucquoy, and the hopes that Frederick's coronation represented prepare to dissolve in the morning fog of November 8, 1620. The battle itself unfolds with the terrible clarity that marks military disasters conceived in overconfidence. You stand on the slope of the White Mountain as the Protestant forces deploy in positions that their commanders believe defensible, the autumn mists thinning in the weak sun of late morning to reveal the imperial troops advancing in their disciplined formations. The sound of cannon reaches you first, then the rolling volleys of musketry, and the smoke of powder hangs in the still air like a second mist more acrid than the natural one it replaces. Frederick's defeat at the White Mountain in 1620 and the subsequent imperial ban transferred his electorate to Bavaria, though the transfer was not formally completed until 1623, and the young king himself fled the field before the rout was complete, his reign as King of Bohemia having lasted less than 16 months. The mists persist in your memory as the visual emblem of this disaster, the fog that concealed the imperial advance becoming the metaphor for the obscurity into which Frederick's cause has fallen. The years that follow bring the systematic Habsburg repression of Bohemia, the execution of its rebel leaders in the old town square, the recatholicization of a kingdom that had experimented with religious pluralism. You move through this transformed landscape as through a country after plague, the empty spaces where Protestant communities once flourished, now filled with the apparatus of counter-reformation discipline. The transfer of the Palatinate electorate to Bavaria in 1623 represents the system bending under war's pressure. The constitutional framework that had preserved the electoral college's integrity since the Golden Bull finally breaking to accommodate the military realities that the 30 Years' War has created. Maximilian of Bavaria receives the electoral title as reward for his loyalty to the Habsburg cause, and the Palatinate that Frederick abandoned enters its long period of foreign occupation and devastation. The scratching of quills at Westphalia, diplomats composing a peace that preserved forms while changing substance, still lies more than 2 decades in the future, and the war continues its grinding consumption of lives and territories. The war reaches its middle years with no resolution visible, the imperial armies advancing and retreating across German landscapes that grow progressively more desolate. You find yourself in a village somewhere in Franconia, the thatch of its cottages blackened by the passage of soldiers, the fields untilled for seasons beyond counting, the surviving inhabitants moving through their diminished lives with the guarded expressions of people who have learned that hope is dangerous. The slow accumulation of dust on the Golden Bull copies in electoral archives continues in the silence of rooms where no one now bothers to consult these documents, still legally binding, increasingly irrelevant to the actual conduct of imperial politics. The dust falls on the parchment where the electoral procedures are prescribed, falls on the seals that authenticate these copies, falls on the wooden chests where they are stored against the possibility of some future need that no one seriously anticipates. The negotiations that will eventually produce the Peace of Westphalia begin in their desultory fashion in the 1640s, the various parties gathering in the 2 Westphalian towns of Münster and Osnabrück, with the reluctance of men who have fought too long to easily imagine peace. You are in the council chamber at Münster on a spring morning in 1648, the light entering through tall windows that overlook a garden where the first flowers are showing among carefully tended borders. The scratching of quills fills the room with its persistent, soft sound. The negotiators bent over documents that will redefine the political map of Central Europe without fundamentally altering its constitutional vocabulary. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 confirmed 8 electors, adding Bavaria and restoring the Palatinate. The Electoral College expanded to accommodate claims from the war, though some historians argue the system was preserved yet weakened by the compromises necessary to maintain it. The final sessions of the Congress extend through the summer months, and you move between the 2 negotiating sites, observing the slow emergence of agreement from the accumulated positions of years. The air in the council rooms smells of sealing wax and ink and the unwashed wool of men who have lived too long in close quarters, and the candles burn late into the northern evenings as the final articles are composed and revised. The Habsburg eagle appears on the imperial ratification of this peace, its presence now so established in the visual language of European power that no one remarks upon it. The gradual displacement of older heraldry complete beyond the possibility of reversal. The elector's role in choosing emperors continued formally until 1806, but real choice had long since disappeared, and the confirmation of 8 electors in 1648 represents the last significant adjustment of a body that will persist in ceremonial function while its original purpose atrophies. The decades after Westphalia bring the slow consolidation of territorial states within the empire's nominal framework, the Habsburgs ruling their Austrian, Bohemian, and Hungarian lands with an absolutism that makes the constitutional limitations of the imperial office increasingly irrelevant to their actual power. You are in Vienna for the coronation of Leopold I in 1658, the Hofburg displaying the Baroque magnificence that will characterize Habsburg self-presentation for generations to come. The air smells of the thousands of candles that illuminate the ceremony, of the perfumes that mask the less pleasant odors of a crowded court, of the incense that rises in the cathedral where the Archbishop of Prague places the crown of Bohemia on Leopold's head. The electors perform their ancient role with the precision of actors who have rehearsed their parts until they require no conscious thought, and the Habsburg succession proceeds with the automatic quality that has become its defining characteristic. The 18th century opens with the Habsburg succession still unbroken, the electors still assembling when required to cast their ceremonial votes for candidates whose identity is known before the proceedings begin. You find yourself in the electoral archive at Mainz, where one of the copies of the Golden Bull has been stored since 1356, the document that established the procedures you have witnessed across the centuries of this narrative. The slow accumulation of dust has continued through the decades since your last visit to such a place, the dust now visible as a soft grey covering that has not been disturbed by any hand seeking consultation. Still legally binding, increasingly irrelevant, the document rests in its case while the empire it was designed to govern has transformed into something that its authors would not recognize, the forms surviving while the substance has drained away through the slow leakage of historical change. The final decades of the empire approach with the inevitability that marks all long-established institutions in their terminal phase. You move through this closing period as through the rooms of a house whose inhabitants have already begun to pack for departure, the furniture remaining in place, but the life that gave it meaning preparing to depart. The Golden Bull remained technically in force until the empire's dissolution, though increasingly ignored in practice, its provisions observed in the breach by princes who had constructed their own jurisdictions upon the ruins of imperial authority that the document had been designed to prevent. The last scene finds you in the August heat of 1806, in the palace at Vienna, where Francis has signed the instrument that ends the empire his Habsburg ancestors had dominated for so long. The scratching of quills has its final echo in this last document, the abdication that preserves no forms at all, that simply terminates the constitutional existence of a body that had long since ceased to function as its creators intended. The Habsburg eagle will continue to appear on the devices of the Austrian Empire that Francis retains, the gradual displacement of older heraldry now so complete that the eagle itself has become the old heraldry, the symbol that younger nations will eventually seek to displace in their turn. You step out into the evening, and the air of Vienna carries the warmth of the day that is passing, the sounds of a city that will continue its existence indifferent to the constitutional change that has just been proclaimed. Somewhere in the archives of the former electorates, the copies of the Golden Bull rest in their accumulated dust, still legally binding until the empire's dissolution that has now occurred, increasingly irrelevant to any political reality that will follow. The slow accumulation of dust will continue, though the archives themselves will pass to new jurisdictions, new arrangements of power that owe nothing to the electoral constitution that the Golden Bull established. The dust falls on documents that no longer bind anyone, falls on the traces of intentions that outlasted their original purposes, falls on the form that survived its content with the tenacity that written law commands against time's ordinary dissolution.